Hello and welcome to 6 Part. Today I'm gonna start a new series, What If Deku Unlocked the Adrenaline Quirk. If you enjoy this video, please give it a big thumbs up, and to watch more videos like this, subscribe to my channel and turn that bell notification on so you never miss an upload. Now wasting no more time, let's begin.
Blood. It was just so abundant. It's so prevalent everywhere. It was dripping slowly from his body like water from a tap, causing a monotonous annoyance that kept reoccurring in Izuku's head at a steady pace, making it even more excruciating. In addition, he could feel his lungs breathing steadily in and out next to his erratic heart, his fingers broken and nearly irreparable as evidence of his struggle and effort, and the fractures and breaks in his bones. Izuku knew what was happening as the blur around his vision started to wash over to the point where he could only make out colors and shapes in a hazy way. He was at the tournament in UA, and he was fighting Todoroki. At this point, the fiery flares that had been subtly engraved into his skin started to retaliate against him, serving as yet another reminder of his struggle. His bones rattling around inside him, he had cried out with all his might, in a moment of weakness towards his opponent, in a moment of kindness and compassion for Izuku, that the abilities of the half-cold half-hot quirk owner were his own and not his father's. The boy then used his long-dormant fire powers to completely destroy Izuku's body, not the best of decisions. If Todoroki was strong before, this new firepower was going to set him up leaps and bounds above the rest of Class 1A. Maybe even the entire year. The green-haired boy laughed a little before recoiling at how it jostled around the bones in his chest, and he chose to stay in his slumped position near the arena's edge to regain any semblance of feeling in his body. Then, as if by storm, he recalled that this was being televised, that everyone in Tokyo was tuning in, including his mother and his friends. He recalled his pledge to himself and everyone else that he would overcome this and demonstrate to them his true nature and potential strength, that his dream was not a far-off fantasy that would never come true. Then he realized that when he had stood up and instructed Todoroki to use his abilities, he had thrown that shot out of the window. Indeed, he was ecstatic for his classmate. Indeed, he could have written a lot more about this discovery in his notes. But he couldn't help but have a persistent desire in his heart and soul about not being able to showcase his abilities to the fullest. I guess it's always next time. Then it dawned on him. He could feel those eyes peering into his soul and pushing him to take one more step. Izuku could feel the drive returning to him from that cloud of figures that existed in a plane that was not of this world and had 8 pairs of eyes that glowed with passion and intensity. One for all is seen in those eyes. Izuku gritted his teeth and decided. He had given it his all, his wholehearted effort, but in order to be a hero like All Might, one had to surpass even that. In order to attain the same level of strength and accomplishment as the previous one for all owners, one had to surpass everything. Flashes of the UCG villain incident materialized before his eyes, and he was reminded of how valiantly All Might had battled on their behalf, always going above and beyond to defeat Nomu. He had to be more than just All Might now. He felt his bones grind and mash together unevenly as he curled his hand into a fist around the shattered earth, but for now he didn't care. Izuku stood up in a trembling, shuddering mass of human flesh, almost in a trance. His ears soon picked up sound again, but all he could make out was the quiet murmurs of the throng and the abrupt halt of trainers dragging across the ground. He lifted the broken face of his one-healed hand to his face and gritted his teeth again, trying to rub the blur out of his eyes, only to have a thin layer of blood seeping from his mouth onto his palm. Izuku chose to sneer and got his eyes cleared. The son of Endeavor, Todoroki Shoto, was visibly shocked and appeared to be in a state of shock that affected the entire stadium. The boy with green hair turned his head and attracted the attention of multiple teachers and students, who gazed at him with curious and remarkably large worried eyes. Izuku gave his opponents less attention when he painfully and loudly cracked the bones in his hands, setting every nerve in his body on fire. However, to him, this only served to fan the flames already burning deep inside of him. Round 2 Todoroki. The rest of Class 1A could only watch in dismay and agitated delight from the stands as they saw Midoriya brought back to life. They could never have imagined that after being so thoroughly defeated by Todoroki's newfound abilities and even by the limitations of his own quirk, Izuku would be so strong and willing to fight back. They were seeing something truly amazing. With a trembling voice, Kirishima asked, "W.O., who knew Midoriya had it in him?" The red-haired boy was as engrossed in the scene as the rest of the class. Why yay, and all this is coming after he had already smashed his bones to nothingness beforehand. Damn. The punk girl twisted her earphone jacks around her fingers to release her mounting anxiety, and Jiru couldn't help but agree. Certain members, such as Hagakure and Mina, had their hands so tightly gripped the rail in front of them that I thought they might break any moment. The pink-skinned girl's face was filled with worry and concern, and her feet's constant shuffling and wrinkling revealed how the invisible girl felt about the whole thing. Some were unreadable, like Shoji and Tokioyami, who were staring at each other with an unclear expression regarding their classmate, and others, like Iida and Momo, were whispering about the possibilities of how this happened after Izuku had already sustained this much damage. Others, like Mineta and Kaminari, were watching with glazed-over expressions mixed with jealousy thrown into their concern for good measure. Some were like Uraraka. The girl had closed in on herself, her eyes still completely focused on the fight, and she leaked out into the world with sheltered concern. And still others shared Bakugo's disinterested, indifferent appearance, but their eyes were fixed on the scene from the corners of their eyes. To put it simply, everyone was eager to see how this new factor would play out. Along with the teacher, they all looked on in morbid curiosity as Izuku's fist cracked loudly, causing the crowd to tremble and cringe as the bones snapped together violently. They looked at one another and started to sulk about these new factors in silence. The match was supposed to end a few seconds ago, but Izuku managed to get back up in time to continue playing. And All Might, looking down at young Midoriya, sat from this stand, a fierce veil of concern covering his face. Yagi couldn't help but feel guilty because, in his mind, Izuku's quirk was the reason he did this in the first place. It caused him to injure himself whenever he attempted to save someone or perform a brave deed. However, Yagi was also perplexed and intrigued by Izuku's recent behavior. Sure, he had experienced some thrilling fights when he was a hero, where he had to stand after being severely beaten down, but this was something else entirely. He was lost in thought when the principal approached the slender man's frozen form. Nobody noticed the quiet pitter-patter of footsteps. The principal knelt beside the man and said something in a low voice. "Do you know anything about this Yagi?" Pulling the #1 hero from his daze, the man answered right away. "If I'm to be honest, no idea. Nothing to this extent has ever happened to me before." The mouse gave the taller man a small sniff and raised his eyebrows. "What about the fight with Chainsaw? Or the Hateful Eight? They both took you down to your last legs a few times, just like with young Midoriya now, so, what do you mean?" Looking down at the field, both men sat staring at the battered and smirky figure of Midoriya Izuku for a minute. His skin was making very slight marks and indentations on the flesh, and a thin veil of red and blue lightning crackled and sparked the air all around him. And then there were his eyes. His pupils seemed tiny and nearly empty in comparison to the thicker layer of white in his sclera, but they were there, conducting lightning strikes and sparks like a generator until his eyes were completely obscured by red and blue hues. "When I was fighting them, I was fighting to save people and to help people. At the minute, Midoriya is finally being selfish. He is deciding to fight for himself and show his power. An almost villainous act in the eyes of some, but there is something else that is there within him, something I just can't quite place, but trust me, it's there." Yagi inhaled deeply and turned back to his successor. "And it will make him even stronger than I." A lone man, his body concealed by layers of black and a hood, sat in a dull, dark room in the middle of the city, lit only by computer monitors and screens. He was aimlessly fiddling with his fingers while he gazed at the silhouettes of two boys engaged in combat on his screen. Of the duel between Shoto Todoroki and Izuku Midoriya. And he felt an almost impossible grin come to his face as he watched. This was Midoriya, the boy from earlier, the one with the green hair who had threatened to cancel his plans at the training center before All Might had arrived. "Huh, looks like you got some skill, kid. Show me more." A few blocks away, two figures stood in front of a low TV, bathed in its bright light, while the sound rumbled through bloodstained and dilapidated walls. One was a girl wearing a schoolgirl's uniform, her blonde hair tied in an odd, uneven manner so that two strands hung down on either side of her face, revealing a set of sharp canine teeth and yellow eyes. Her cheeks flushed a bright red. There was also a new layer of bloodstain on the outfit. She was sitting on the dismembered corpse of a man who no longer even looked human at the moment, staring at one of the two people on TV with a depressed expression on her face. A tall, thin man with uneven pale skin, wrinkled purple flesh that appeared sewn together, a disheveled black hairstyle, and black eyes stood behind her. His attire included black pants and sneakers, as well as an open black shirt with a white undershirt. His confused expression was fixed on his partner right now. Toga, why are we watching this?" The girl replied almost right away. "We need to watch this, Dobby. We just need to. I need to see this cutie all bloody," she exclaimed, her voice sing-songy and menacing at the same time. "The green-haired one is really cute and cut up, and I think he's going to get more bloody." Dobby sighed and turned his attention to the screen, intending to watch the action play out rather than argue with her. Hopefully this'll be worth something. Izuku grinned broadly and took a step forward, feeling his foot's bones shift painfully. Todoroki simply sighed in front of him before turning to look him in the eye. Midoriya, you're hurt, you can't possibly continue. Izuku laughed at this. Then, with a narrowed gaze, he channeled one for all into his legs and leapt with tremendous force and speed at the half-hot, half-cold Quirk user. Izuku shot forward into the air, and there was a loud crunch of bone. He just roared in pain, regaining his fist, and swung his power-imbued limb at the boy in front of him. Todoroki dodged out of instinct just in time to avoid being struck, but it didn't stop Izuku from slamming his fist into the ice wall to his right. Izuku roared out, splintering the entire wall with a single blow and sending shockwaves of power that scattered the shards across the arena in a display of brutality and agony. Seizing the opportunity, Todoroki leapt backward and away from the boy with green hair, standing unsteadily on his fractured legs and inspecting his fist. It was obviously broken and severely damaged, with the skin severely bruised and scoured around his fingers and knuckles. Blood was also starting to leak out of those same skin fissures, cascading onto the ground like a red cascade. But Izuku seemed to ignore it, choosing instead to use his other hand to push the fingers back into position, which caused a loud click to resound throughout the stadium. Izuku shook his head, then his gaze returned to Todoroki. In an instant, he leapt at him once more, his legs breaking as he charged ahead. With no time to spare, Todoroki decided to conjure an ice wall in order to at least slow down the boy with immense power in front of him. It didn't occur. Izuku didn't even hesitate to continue his attack on Todoroki, smashing through the icy windowpane with such ease that he made contact with the boy's stomach. Izuku unleashed a forceful sweep that sent Todoroki hurtling into the distance, cutting through the air at previously unheard-of speeds before crashing into yet another of his ice sculptures. Izuku grunted and sank his fist into his chest, snarling at the pain. He then raised both arms into the air and swiftly swept them down in an arc. The speed he created a huge gust of air that was similar to what happened when he flicked his fingers, only much wilder and more frantic as it tore across the skies in the direction of the downed Todoroki. The boy managed to grab hold of it quickly enough to launch himself into the air before it could harm him. But just as he was about to leave, the edge got his foot, and the earth collapsed around him, sending him spiraling downward. Once more, Izuku was there, his eyes nearly melting from the agony as he lit his arms in mid-jump and smashed them into Todoroki's stomach, sending the boy hurtling into the shattered earth and shattering it even more. The boy with green hair descended to the floor with equal speed, slipping beneath Todoroki's bounced form and then using his hands as a spring beneath his back to launch a twisting ick directly at the boy's spine. Todoroki, who was thrown into the air again and was howling in agony, attempted to counter the ever-aggressive Izuku. He threw a hand to the ground, and as he flew, row upon row of sharp icicles began to emerge from the floor, obstructing any entrance to his rapidly vanishing form. Izuku hurriedly leapt back at the dual-colored boy, spitting out blood as he watched him fly off. He smashed through the icicles with reckless abandon, not even caring that they bit and cut into his flesh. He leapt at the other boy again, foot first, finally catching up to him, his body trying to stand after being kicked around like a rag doll. Pulling it back, he lunged at him, barely missing his head in the process. However, just as he was ducking, a blade of air shot out and sliced into the earth behind him. Seizing the opportunity to avenge, Todoroki grabbed Izuku's head, set fire to his knee, and slammed his face into it with such force that the boy bounced up a little before letting the other, ice-infused leg smash into his side, sending him spiraling a few meters away. But Izuku was only down for a short while. Izuku flipped up backwards with his hands, creating another snap. Leaping back with his feet raised, he started to widely swing and swipe them, creating an increasing number of blades to slice towards his opponent. Todoroki gritted his teeth and tried to dodge them, but several bit his exposed flesh and tore up the earth beneath his feet, making it difficult for him to stand. Seizing the chance, Izuku dashed forward, slamming his body like a comet back down to earth, using Todoroki's head as a springboard. Pieces of land shot up into the sky and Todoroki flew with them as the world collapsed under his impact. The boy used this as an opportunity to end the fight, growling as he saw that Izuku was resetting his bones again, groaning as he did so. He quickly navigated the floating pieces by rolling until he reached Izuku, at which point he slammed a fist of fire straight into his chest, sending flames and heat shooting out across the stadium. Enough! With that shout, he saw Izuku's silhouette take off into the raging conflagration that had consumed the entire other half of the stadium. He staggered backward, inhaled deeply, and felt the impact of Izuku's blows. A couple of shattered ribs and contused muscles. Fortunately, His ice shielded the majority of the harm. He leaned over and let the stadium noises take over. But there was a sound coming from the fire. All eyes were focused on the fire right away, and they watched as a figure started to emerge from the heat while holding their breath. And Izuku emerged from the flames, his body broken, blood and sweat streaming down his face. He had gritted teeth. He tore off the top portion of his outfit and threw it into the fire because it was torn and shredded so much like Todoroki's right side. As a result, the world saw his rather lean and built physique, and many girls found themselves blushing despite the circumstances at the sight of the hard muscle on display on this once scrawny boy. They described it as strange and intriguing. Izuku just fixed all of his attention on Todoroki, not even noticing their looks, before he began to jog gently. Todoroki imitated. After that, it turned into a sprint between the two sides. Todoroki repeated the copy. This ultimately culminated in an all-out sprint by both competitors to the middle of the field, during which they both let out battle cries and leapt into the air in the direction of one another. But instead of Izuku's fist draw, a tremendous amount of buildup and crackling was forming around his skull. Everyone realized at once what he was doing. He was going to force his quirk into Todoroki's skull. Izuku leapt from the ground with such lightning speed that Todoroki was unable to stop it. Rather, he had to endure the pain of Izuku colliding with him at a slightly angled collision, striking his chest with his head and sending him flying back, shockwaves trailing behind him as he flew and liquid gushing out of his mouth. Izuku started to feel the kickback at the same moment, and he flew back in the opposite direction as well. He hit the ground first, colliding with it again, and came to a stop just as Todoroki did. As they waited for one of them to move, the stadium fell silent. No, they didn't. Izuku, spluttering and coughing, woke up. He heaved in and out of air, trying hard and hard to get any feeling back into his lungs, which hurt and shook as he coughed. He could taste and feel the blood in his mouth, as well as the copious amounts of spit and saliva that had accumulated over however long he had been unconscious. And all of this was in addition to the broken and sloshy movement he was experiencing in his head. It felt as though a heavy piece of earth was being carried downstream by his skull like a river. He felt like total sh*t in every part of his body. He became aware of his circumstances and surroundings after his coughing fit. The teenager noticed the ringing in his ears immediately, and it was evident how the piercing sound affected his bruised and battered body. Subsequently, his body produced incessant clicking noises with any slight movement, be it in his arms, legs, or chest. This was particularly evident when he tried to wipe away the few drops and slivers that had escaped him during his outburst, only to hiss in agony as his bones creaked beneath his skin. Simply put, hearing it hurt. He recognized the location as a hospital or nurse's office, specifically Recovery Girl's office, since he had visited the place frequently enough to be familiar with it. What caught him off guard, though, was how few other patients there were. Normally, there would be at least one other person present, even if it was just a student gathering supplies or getting over a minor headache that would go away in 5 minutes, but today there was nobody. However, supplies and medication were still available, so what was? He had forgotten how he got here in his daze and the instant sense of awareness returning. That was what was going on with the UA games. He started to remember what had happened to him and started to laugh and then wince at his foolishness and then his anguish. This time, though, his memory struck him like a train, more precisely, like a fistful of one for all right in the face. At this point, he also became aware that his body was bound in numerous layers of surgical cloth, serving as yet another reminder of his ordeal. Due to the fact that he had engaged in another round of combat with Todoroki, he had severely damaged his body, surpassing even the severity of the first round. Splintering flesh of his arms and legs that withstood his attacks without forcing his bones straight out through the skin. Broken fingers with rings of reddened skin, exposed knuckles that bled rivers of red. And, to top it all off, a broken skull that he had used as some sort of last-minute attack strategy, which Izuku claimed was caused by him watching too many Quirk-related animes and cartoons. The green-haired boy, despite the pain, reached up towards the back of his head to feel around where he thought a break would be. Instead, he felt the newly integrated grooves and curves all over the bone. His skull had been completely shattered in that one attack, so how was he still alive? It was something to do with your Quirk. A tiny yelp was all that was required of Izuku when an old voice suddenly broke through the ringing in his ears. He glanced to his right and saw Recovery Girl, a woman with a strange mix of curiosity and rage on her face that made him smile weakly. Izuku took a few moments to comprehend what she had said. My Quirk. What about it? He appeared uneasy, much like he had been during all those previous encounters. But deep down, he was terrified. What was the extent of her knowledge? Is she aware of One for All? Is she aware of? Before you ask, yes, I know about One for All. Is she reading Quirk with a mind of her own? Izuku effectively seized up all movement of his body as she began to walk over. She curtly and strictly replied, I'm actually a close friend of All Might, so stop your worrying, Midoriya. Now, about this new development in your quirk. I assume that you have no idea what is happening to your body? He gave a nod. She sighed and said, of course, you don't. Well, considering your interest to All Might, I also assume that you know that he doesn't have this sort of ability? What do you mean by eye interest? She now had a sly smile on her face as Izuku started to lose interest. I don't actually know if you think that you are being subtle, but kid, your costume looks like a really bad rip-off the man. It's not that hard to see. Oh. Anyhow, you understand that All Might lacks this ability, right? Yes. Wait, what do you mean by able? If you let me continue without asking questions every sentence, then I might be able to tell you. He looked deflated again. Recovery Girl was now sitting on a seat next to Izuku's bed. Now then, in your fight you seemed to go into an unnaturally driven state of thought that ignored all sort of pain to push through to defeat Shoto, am I correct? Recovery Girl asked. Well, not exactly. This got her interest. I could still feel the pain as I was fighting. Every time I moved, it hurt, but it just made me want to fight more, like it was a really sick power-up or something. Towards the end, he started to mumble and mutter to Recovery Girl under his breath, his speech turning into an incomprehensible string of words, but to her credit, she wasn't really listening. Rather, the first part of the sentence caught his attention. She smirked as Izuku turned to face her, breaking out of his mumbles. Ah, now that explains stuff a lot more then. She grabbed several papers off the desk and pushed them in his direction. Seeing this as a signal, he went to pick them up. He saw something really horrifying when he looked at the picture of a skeleton. His own, specifically, that was on the paper. Two photos, one of his skeleton and the other of his muscles, showed horrifying pictures of his body after using One for All, broken and bruised. They appeared to be pieces, not even entirely assembled structures anymore, but amazingly, they didn't appear as damaged as he had anticipated. What had been happening, exactly? You know about how All Might can change between his two forms, correct? Well, that isn't something that all One for All users can do. It is just a side effect of the quirk due to his unique genes. And after some scans, and the information that you just revealed to me, I can confidently say that this looks to be your side effect to taking on One for All. And what exactly is my side effect? Well, I suppose that you thought that your body looked better than you thought, huh? So did I, but after some further analysis using some friends with specific quirks at the event, we noticed that when you went into this state, one we all nicknamed adrenaline, your body became more fluid and in tune with itself. This was all due to One for All. My friends don't know about the quirk, if you're worried. Anyway, from the scans I was sent, I could see faint threads of energy linking your bones together as well as large build-ups around your ligaments. This was the side effect, Izuku. Izuku's expression seemed to be filled with confusion, beckoning Recovery Girl to carry on. When your body becomes victim of enough pain and stress, it goes into a state of fight or flight. It ultimately decides to go into fight. With this decision, One for All acts like a catalyst and support for your cells and nerves, muscles and bones, by linking them together under a collection of connections or build-ups in case of your ligaments. By doing this, it allows more damage to be dealt to your bones before they completely break like before, forcing them together to become a stronger piece for the time that the ability is active, but it also allows your ligaments to have less strain due to the protection and support of One for All. Alongside this, the connections also mean that your cells can react better and so they have stronger healing capabilities, meaning that you can go on for longer periods of time. In addition, any extra pain inflicted onto you, whether that be from your own body or an outside source, boosts these benefits and even increases your overall power output for a short amount of time. However, there is also a letdown period to this ability. After the drawn-out explanation, she sighed and then took another scan, this time using an X-ray taken shortly after he collapsed on the field. Immediately after the usage of adrenaline ends, your body shuts down for a while. The connections disappear and so do the benefits, leaving your body empty for a short time, about 30 seconds in this case, but that may increase with usage. Due to this, the healing stops and doesn't begin again for a while, which results in some complications. She then pointed to her head. Such as your skull. It was halfway through healing after your ridiculous stunt at the end of the fight when usage stopped abruptly. This left many marks and indents unhealed to the point where even I couldn't help, which now permanently has these grooves in it. Alongside this, your accelerated healing is not untouchable. It can and will shut down prematurely if you take too much damage. It can be beaten out of you. I'm sorry, Izuku. He reached up to touch his fractured skull again as she concluded her remarks with a pitying expression. That was a summary of his new skill. Adrenaline. A power that allowed him to withstand his suffering and use it as a multiplier of strength. Interesting. Perilous. But despite all of his shortcomings, he would need to make the most of his quirk if he truly wanted to be a hero. He made up his mind while balling his fist in his hair. He looked Recovery Girl in the eye and said, "Thank you for your concern and the information, but if I really want to be a hero like All Might, I'll need to be able to take everything that is thrown at me." His eyes narrowed with resolve. "And I made a promise to do just that." Initially, the nurse's expression was so confused and dejected that it almost gave the impression that she had no faith in him at all. However, it was because he was handling this so well. He had no regrets, no sadness, just a strong resolve to perform even better the next time. This was not a teenage boy's way of thinking. This was the way that of a champion. She leaned over and carefully unwrapped his arms, saying, "That's good to hear, Izuku. But you can't forget that you used your arms and legs a lot in that fight, so they weren't untouched, you know." Izuku winced at what he saw, but during his training as a hero, he had seen worse. Many cuts and bruises covered both of his arms. The scars pricked at his skin, leaving both of his hands somewhat misshapen and deformed. He could accept that they would never be the same somehow. This is, different?" She chuckled at that. "Now, not that I don't like this new attitude of yours, Izuku, but you need to remember that this ability doesn't make you invincible. Then you will be hurt even more, maybe even die." Suddenly there was a heavy silence. "Then I'll get stronger," he said, raising his head and fixing his unwavering gaze on the ceiling while a slowly spreading smile spread across his face. "I don't know how, but I'll do it. Maybe with some suit modifications or some sort of outside medical help." He quickly looked at her, "But I will do it. Don't you worry." His voice was filled with that same conviction once more, and for some reason, it eased the anxiety she was feeling in her chest. Slowly patting his arm, she spoke to the boy in a quiet voice. "Izuku, you'll make a great hero someday." She got up from the chair and started to head out the door when Izuku had an epiphany. Hey, how was Todoroki?" "Oh, him? He was fine, however, you cost him his place in the finals, that's for sure. They had that red-haired idiot Kirishima replace him." Izuku remained silent for a while, only letting out a small sigh when worried about his friend's condition. Wait, did you say that I cost him his place in the final?" She grinned. How long have I been out for?" 2 days. 2 days? Oh my god. About releasing you, I'd say we can release you later today, barring any strenuous movement. I left a laptop on the table in case you want to see what you missed." Thank you." Izuku reached over cautiously to take the laptop after she had left, clicked on a few things, and quickly navigated to the main homepage, changing the settings to most recent and seeing a list of many trending topics and most searched results. At the top of the search bar was a title that read, "Winners of the UA Games?" Clicking on it, he was taken to a page where the top 3 were revealed. As it turns out, Kirishima had taken the place of Todoroki, with the final matchups being with Bakugo going up against Iida, who apparently forfeited and then left the stadium entirely, and Kirishima versus Tokiyami, with the Shadow Quirk user winning the duel. In the description of the finale, which was Bakugo versus Tokiyami, it was stated that the explosion Quirk user was distraught and angered at the fact that he wouldn't be fighting against the quoted, most powerful student in their whole fucking grade, and as such began to copiously shout and scream and curse, "Fucking Deku with his stupid fucking quirk." This was shortly followed by a picture of the podium with Tokiyami and Kirishima offering the camera a neutral or overly toothy grin, whereas Bakugo looked to be restrained and tired up on the number 1 spot with a medal stuffed into his mouth. Izuku just sighed. He would be in for hell when he entered school tomorrow. The terrible news that the hero Igenium had retired following an attack by the hero killer was the next option down. Izuku worried about Iida right away because the boy had previously told him and Uraraka about his brother. This must have been the reason he left the stadium, he thought to himself in a low voice. Feeling a little depressed, he hurriedly searched for his phone but couldn't find it. Sighing, he decided to move on. A few trends passed with little progress, like some hero companies showing interest in the 3 UA Games winners and still having a strong interest in the new abilities of a certain half-cold, half-hot hero, which made Izuku happy that he hadn't ruined Todoroki's chances too much. What shocked him, though, was seeing his own name in one of the articles, citing his drive to win and excellent combat focus with keen strategy as a winning factor that some companies might want to pick him up. Not nearly as much as what was about to happen. The boy's eyes popped out of his skull and his body seized up when he saw the 5th most trending topic. He was the 5th most searched topic. H's name was Izuku Midoriya. That was his name. He hesitated to click on it until he recovered from the shock, which took some time. He then experienced a range of emotions, from extreme pride at reading about how some people thought he was the highlight of the games and how his powers would make him a great hero to disappointment at reading about how some critics thought his aggressive tactics and reckless behavior made him unreliable. Finally, he experienced something that literally made him jump. Izuku Midoriya is the UA game's hottest guy #1. What the heck? He was so overcome with curiosity that he clicked on it, only to see a large, bold picture of his shirtless figure during his fight with Todoroki to appear on screen along with a brief synopsis of his endearing qualities. It turned out that the person who had written this had attended UA and had heard of Izuku previously, based on her notes, which stated that he was nice and handsome with that sort of awkward personality that would make a girl coo and scream in awe at, while his personality was still tough enough that he could protect you and make you feel safe. Also, his muscles were such a nice set that it put some modern bodybuilders to shame with their attractiveness. It was fair to say that Izuku was so red and so deep into his covers due to the compliments that he was certain he was going to pass out again. That was just a link to a rabbit hole of Izuku's newly discovered fame. The next article discussed Izuku and how he could be useful to certain, larger hero companies, as well as how he was similar to famous heroes like All Might. That made his heart soar with pride, as he was being compared to the All Might. Then, he was thrown back into a sea of embarrassment when the next article again discussed his attractiveness and strife compared against not just other students in his class, but also other famous heroes. What really got Izuku dizzy and floored was an interview with several heroes following the event, where both Mount Lady and Ectoplasm commented on his fight as being a highlight, with himself being singled out. Mount Lady even called him cute. Izuku leaned back, unable to do more than sigh in shock at his new situation. It appeared that he had a fanbase. The females of Class 1A were seated around a table at the school and engaged in conversation about the UA games, which had happened 2 days prior. "So, has anyone approached you guys to discuss the games?" With a broad smile and a self-assured demeanor that revealed to the others what had happened to her, Mina asked. Momo conceded to the group, sighing with disappointment as she crossed her arms and leaned back in her chair. "Yes, I did. Unfortunately, most of it was just to comment on my looks in a cheerleading outfit, or to ask me out rather than my skills, unfortunately. At least a few individuals spoke with you. Not a single person spoke to me." The energetic, high-pitched voice caused the entire group to flinch for a brief moment before focusing on what appeared to be an empty chair. Toru, maybe it was because they couldn't. As usual, Tsuyu Asui said in an astute and direct manner, "They didn't see you." Was the reply. "Anyway, I think I was talked to twice? But it's still cool, huh?" As Juru spoke, her jacks were idly wrapped around her fingers once more. They all turned their heads to the side and focused on one quiet, turned-in audience member after waiting for the other member of their group to speak for a while before they were met with silence. "Hey, Uraraka? Have you had any conversations?" The girl from the south finally noticed her friends and quickly looked up to find the others staring at her, giving her already red cheeks a slight red flush. "Huh? Oh, yeah, I was spoken to," she muttered softly, then dropped her gaze back to her lap, leaving the other girls to guess what she was thinking. "Are you still fretting over Izuku?" Uraraka's face turned even redder as her head shot up, a sharp contrast to what she had done moments earlier. "Wow, what are you discussing?" The others could only laugh at such an egregious show of affection. With a sly smile adorning her pink skin, Mina replied, "You don't have to be like that. We all get worried about our friends." Uraraka remained silent in response to the jest. As for Izuku, who would have guessed that he possessed it? Toru raised her voice, her customary fervor replaced by admiration and concern for her fellow student. "Does he really think he can win the fight by enduring such intense pain and anger?" Looking in the general direction of the invisible girl, Momo questioned. "Or the fact he possesses that particular set of muscles?" Now that Sue, who is always so enthusiastic, had brought up a topic that no one had really discussed, everyone was flushed. "Yeah, that part of it, but mainly that change that he had when he went down," the group's pink-skinned girl said, chuckling slightly as she explained it to the others. Juru looked down at her phone and started typing something on the keyboard. "Yeah, like before he did all this stuff with his fingers to attack, but that whole thing was something else entirely." Uraraka's soft voice, with so many distinct tones coming through, struck the rest of the group like a ton of bricks when she said, "More like someone else." "Yes, that's right. How are you doing?" Mina began to speak cautiously, but Jiru's voice broke through before she could finish. Holy shit. She quickly shoved her phone in the center of the table, causing everyone's eyes to bulge as they saw the information in front of them. Their classmate's name, which was ranked 5th on the trending list. A gust of wind that appeared to be invisible turned the phone 90 degrees, giving Toru a better view of the information. Wow. That's a thing. I wonder what it says, Mina said, cautiously reaching over to touch the screen. After a few tense moments, it revealed, Izuku Midoriya rated #1 hottest guy of the UA games. A picture of Todoroki and Izuku's fight. More precisely, the scene in which Izuku tore off his shirt also appeared. I see. Well, at least we have something to compare to, instead of going to our memories. Mina followed up her action with a nervous giggle as a thin veil of lilac dusted her flesh, and shortly after that, everyone else reacted relatively similarly, with the exception of Uraraka, who just sort of froze while staring at the picture. That is, everything except the blood flowed to her cheeks. The bell announcing the start of form finally chimed, causing all the girls to glance at one another before hurriedly making their way to their seats in the same awkward manner as other people started to arrive. It was going to be an odd day. Dabi was in a dark room trying to concentrate on reading about some of the most recent villain-based events. He glanced through them, but every time he came across one group, the League of Villains, he smirked and leaned back in his seat, thinking about how much better Stain was in every way. His commitment, his logic, his execution, his... Tap, tap, tap. Dabi shook his head and went on with his thought process. Turning back a few pages in his notes, he wrote that the League had attempted to attack UA a few weeks prior using a pre-made creature with a variety of unique quirks that could supposedly take on All Might himself. However, for some reason, they were unable to defeat All Might with a creature that had the potential to do so. These people were pitiful, useless, and so awful as villains that... Tap, tap, tap. Gritting his teeth, the villain slowly turned to see Toga's tiny form curled up on a comfortable chair in the corner of the room, with only her phone lighting up her face. Somehow, even after all this time with her, Dabi was still kind of shocked to see that sickly, lovesick expression on her face. Toga, do you mind? I'm trying to do some. Tap, tap, tap. When he finally got to the blonde, he stood behind her bag and tried to see what was on her phone. It was that boy from UA, the green-haired kid who fucked himself up. He looked at the wall for a few moments, rolling his tongue around his mouth, before suddenly getting up and walking over to her. Toga. At last, he managed to get her attention, turning her around so she could see his face, which was hidden by the dimly lit room. Her expression changed to one of strange irritation, which didn't seem appropriate for her. What would you like? She was essentially pretty invested in what she was doing because even her voice sounded annoyed, the one that Dabi had never seen stray from lovesick and childlike and was now filled with malice. He paused, looking over her to notice that she was currently stuck on an image of the boy in a shirtless state, with multiple cuts and marks staining his body. Creeping to a minimum while I do so, he said, I just wanted to tell you that I'm trying to do some work, so can you keep you? With the swiftness with which the words left his mouth, she returned to her own work, silently shooing the fire Quirk user away with a mere yay, yay. To this, he dutifully complied. Looking ahead, Toga found herself lost in the boy's eyes once more. Initially, she was only fascinated by his scars, his cuts, and the battle damage he had sustained due to his own quirk. That was the beginning. Afterward, she started researching him more. First, his name, then his age, then what people believed to be his quirk, then videos of his fight, and before she knew it, she was looking at his pictures and no longer fascinated by his cuts, but by his eyes. In all the photos and videos, she noticed that the green orbs in them lacked something that would complete a person, just like her. Izuku was cute too, even without the cuts, but his quirk seemed to rely more on pain, which made him more attractive in her eyes. Besides, who doesn't love a forbidden romance? She bit her lip and stroked the side of her phone silently, feeling her body tremble. She smiled brightly and felt a few drops of crimson appear on her tongue. Izuku was going to have to bleed for Toga. Izuku felt small for the first time, watching the world go by. Despite everything he has accomplished in the last 3 days, he is staring out the window at all the passing cars, people, trees, and birds, as well as at life in general, without giving a thought to his own well-being. He was content with the way the world was going even without him. To be honest, he had always sort of realized that he was basically worthless, especially since he had not grown up with a quirk, which only served to further lower him into a pit of seeming worthlessness. However, he discovered that his newly found fame from the games had simply made all of this more apparent to him in retrospect. However, that was also the reason he had to be a great hero. Using his newly discovered quirk to be a symbol of something great that could be looked upon and inspire others for years to come, to make sure he meant something to the world, to make sure he could save people and places in the world. He realized that One for All was all about legacy as he looked down at his hands and saw the lumps and cuts that covered his skin. Izuku was already a part of something greater than himself, and he would have to make the most of all the power bestowed upon him in order to fulfill that responsibility, regardless of the challenges he faced. Regardless of the price. Izuku shook his head and pushed his body away from the window ledge, allowing momentum to push him back into the hospital ward and towards some small clothes that were lying on his bed. His current outfit may have seemed complete to some, but Izuku felt that something was amiss about him. His standard issue pants and red trainers were the only items that made up the boy's norm, and his normally tucked-in shirt was flaunted, leaving his red tie hanging around his neck. The UA standard blazer was also left on the bed. But just a few minutes ago, Recovery Girl informed him that he should leave his clothes on because they were made of multiple bandages that had been reapplied before he put them on, and that adding any more layers would only make him uncomfortable. With a sigh, he turned to retrieve his backpack and blazer and was about to return to class after missing 2 days when he was abruptly thrown backward by an unidentified force. Izuku staggered back a few feet, allowing his body to regain control and his vision to clear up before turning to face the object that had knocked him down, a literal wall of muscle. Young Midoriya. I have come to see you. Izuku instinctively recoiled from the harsh tone and loudness of All Might's voice as it leapt around the empty hospital ward, trying to quickly correct himself in front of the man. GG good morning All Might. How was y or d-da? He was cut off before he could say anything else by the sound of blood hitting the ground and a thick cloud of smoke rising up in front of him. Izuku sighed slightly as he prepared for All Might's gaunt skeletal form to appear. With blood seeping between his lips, Toshinori Yagi stood idly in front of him, dressed in a loose shirt and tie. Grinning, the older man asked, Hey kid, how've you been? Wiping away the red that started to run down his chin. Izuku got back up and, grinning, ran his fingers over the newly formed grooves and juts in his skull as he rubbed the back of his head. Me? Oh, I've been fine, Yagi said, smirking as she put a hand on the green-haired boy's shoulder. Oh, just fine. Hey, I think that becoming an internet trend would have made you a little better than fine, hey Midoriya? Izuku's eyes opened at an unparalleled speed, and his face covered in red dust. He stammered and stumbled over his words, his arms trembling and becoming hazy in front of Yagi's eyes. No. That's not the CC case at all. Instead, Yagi simply stood back, chuckling at the little boy's actions, and motioned for Izuku to sit on the bed, which he did. The boy with green hair shot up and seemed to lock eyes with All Might's seemingly sunken eyes, the blue masses glowing with intent and worry. I was just joking, kid, don't worry. No, I'm here to talk to you about your side effect. What about it? Well, I just wanted to know how you feel about it, shrugged Yagi, gesturing to the wall that held multiple, shattered, and cracked photos of Izuku's corpse. The new heir could tell, at least by his appearance, that the man felt culpable for this in some way. It's a challenging situation, to put it mildly. It's hard to understand, I suppose. He shifted on the bed and pressed his fingers into his palm grooves to ease his anxiety. It's just that, I've always been picked on, for being quirkless, and I guess I just learned to accept pain, learned to deal with being knocked down. So, to have this new power forced onto me that relies completely on my willingness to accept my pain is just. Once more, Yagi's unusual manner of standing motionless and barely moving a muscle while telling him his story caused him to stumble over his words. Listen Midoriya, I know all about the ins and outs of your new, adrenaline power and, so, I just wanted to say that you should focus on honing One for All instead of adrenaline for the time being. Stillness. What? Wasn't a terrible question, something that would defy reason altogether. Rather than throwing himself into learning a completely new power that he had just acquired, he should probably train with the quirk that he already possessed if he wanted to get stronger. However, even Izuku was aware that he could practice both techniques simultaneously and work them in concert with one another, so it all might be requesting that he just use one. All I'm saying is that One for All is a difficult power to harness, especially if you want to be able to use it without it breaking your body. In addition, Izuku noticed other small details that revealed Yagi's lack of concern for the situation, such as his constant attempts to avoid looking directly at Izuku. All Might? Wouldn't it make sense for me to try and practice both at the same time? Yagi stopped. I suppose you could do that. The skeletal man sighed and scratched his head, laughing nervously. Alright. Listen Midia. Out of all of the previous one for all users, your side effect is the most dangerous. I didn't mention the whole idea of side effects before because I had no clue as to what yours would be and I didn't want you to obsess over the different possibilities, like you have done with other endeavors. He grinned. However, like I said, yours is the most dangerous of them all, so, if you are going to train it, please be cautious and make sure to. Izuku said, startling both of them. I know. His fists clenched as he spoke. I understand your concern and I wholeheartedly thank you for every opportunity that you have given me, but now I have something to call my own. My own, Quirk. That is completely my own, and to make sure that I don't rely on you constantly, I need to train with it. I need to hone any skill that I have, no matter the cost, no matter the difficulties. When I was younger, I would have given the world for a quirk like this, so I must train hard to give everything given to me back. Yagi looked up at him again. And that starts with you and your quirk. Izuku. Ring ring, both figures looked up to see that the bell indicating the start of class had rung. Just as Yagi opened his mouth to reply once more, a different voice interrupted. Recovery Girl entered the room quietly and said, Okay, Nori, I need to give Izuku one last look over before he goes on his way, so if you mind. With a final glance in Izuku's direction, All Might merely muttered. Izuku had some thinking to do as he left, giving him a pat on the shoulder and saying, Why yay, sure. Remember, young Midoriya, that you shouldn't always have to be the one in pain to relieve others of it. Recovery Girl looked at Izuku sympathetically after a short while and then proceeded with his examination. And now, as Izuku strode through UA's empty halls, his feet felt heavy and weighted. His heavy footsteps struck his form with an unmatched force, seeming to bounce off the walls themselves, and he had to shake his head non-stop to will away the uneasiness and worry that had started to cloud his judgment. Additionally, Recovery Girl had reapplied bandages to his head, arms, and chest, making them so tight that he could only think about the pieces of cloth rather than the crushing realization that had occurred over the past few hours. The green-haired boy carelessly wrapped and unwrapped the bandages around his distorted and jumbled faces of flesh, allowing his thoughts to drift back to a few moments earlier, when he first started to feel this tremendous weight and pressure. Izuku approached a nearby wall, the shine still visible in the immaculate white material, and the boy let his head smash into the construct in an attempt to clear his head after seeing what he had just witnessed at the medical bay. It didn't occur. Rather, Izuku felt a sudden, intense pain that shot through his body, causing his eyes to pop open and his malformed fists to ball into a fighting stance. He could also feel, for some reason, the heat from his skin as it briefly rose against the chilly wall material before falling back down. It was just so exhausting, like coming down from a high. Recovery Girl discovered during the examination that his body had become more sensitive to pain as a result of One for All's new side effect of encouraging him to fight whenever he experienced any kind of physical discomfort. One for All would not be activated by even the slightest pain, and adrenaline would only kick in when he reached a pain threshold that he was still unaware of, but just like this, his body would prepare itself for the use of the quirk by involuntarily trying to go into a fighting stance and by heating up like it would when the quirk was used. Like this whole situation, the development was strange, but what worried him most was the notion that his body was telling him to fight. It wasn't like he enjoyed being in pain, but he would have to get used to it if he was going to be a great hero. Or come to enjoy the sensation. Izuku bit his tongue and stepped back from the wall, smirking a little at the pool of condensation his quick increase in body temperature had left behind. Then, he turned around and walked calmly down the hallway to his homeroom. At last, he arrived at the door. In an attempt to avoid drawing attention to himself, he took a deep breath and opened the door as quietly as possible. But fate was such a cruel bitch. Rather than opening silently, it made the loudest squeaking noise Izuku had ever heard, and the sheer size of the thing almost instantly revealed its identity. Izuku just kind of stumbled into the room with both of his eyes closed, shivering from the noise and the way that every tone of voice he could just barely hear outside of it turned cold and silent. After entering the room, he cautiously opened his eyes to observe the classroom environment. The class in front of him was bewildered and dazed, with expressions of surprise at his abrupt appearance. Two of the teachers, Aizawa and Midnight, laughed at him. He waved a little to his classmates as he turned to face the door frame. Deku. The teenager was the most surprised of all the people in the room when Uraraka leapt from her chair and struck Izuku, almost sending him flying backwards as he struggled to stabilize himself with the help of the door frame. His entire body lit up as he recovered, not just from the tiny jolt of pain that the southern girl's blow to his already damaged chest caused, but also from Uraraka's embrace. Uraraka was giving him a hug. She just held onto him tighter as he froze, unable to even finish the hug, and just held his arms slightly behind her back out of fear of doing something wrong. From the corner of his eye, he noticed that some of his classmates were laughing at the show, while others, Mineta being the most notable, were staring at the display with wide mouths. In fact, Midnight seemed to be making fun of him. He eventually just sort of muttered a few words to the shorter girl. Hi? You're an idiot, you know that? He tried to think of a quick way to respond to her statement, wincing at the sheer amount of pain and anger in her voice, but all he could manage was a quiet jumble of mumbles that he was well known for. But at least it made her laugh, so he felt somewhat better. She eventually released her hold, and when he finally got a good look at her face, all he could think was how gorgeous she was. Her normally pink cheeks had taken on a deep shade of red, and though her eyes were closed, he could see a hint of tears in the corners along with a beaming smile that made him smile a little too. Ahem. Izuku and Uraraka both turned to look at Aizawa when he coughed hard, and the man gave them one of his sickly smiles. The southern girl took that as permission to return to her seat, attempting to ignore her friend's nudges and prods along the way. Izuku, in the meantime, approached the man and asked him what on earth they were doing in class. The eraser quirk user quickly said, "It's nice to have you back, Midoriya, and to know that you're actually alive after that stunt you pulled." The green-haired boy could only laugh awkwardly at his own foolishness. A headbutt? Well, we just started a few minutes ago, so I'll have Midnight explain what you're doing. Izuku turned to face the 18+ rated hero after sinking back into his sleeping bag, and she gave him a weird, menacing smile. She licked her lips at the boy, sending a strange shiver down his spine. "Hello, Izuku. You put up a good fight at the games, maybe a little too good for your own well-being, but a good fight nevertheless. Say, I heard that your quirk, or at least your new thing, relies on pain. If that's true, do you think that you can demonstrate it later?" As Izuku made a hasty retreat from this strange situation, he heard the murmurs of jealous Mineta and Kaminari behind him. "Yeah, that wouldn't be very good right now," he said, turning to face the ground. Izuku's head shot back up at the sound of that, a certain childlike look of wonder in his eyes. "Don't worry, I'm only teasing." "Well, the others have just been working on their hero names." She offered him a whiteboard and a pen before telling him to go sit down and saying, "We'll be revealing them to the class in about 10 minutes, so go ahead and think of them." Twisting on his heels, the teenager attempted to keep his eyes hidden from every student in the class. But he only had one person in his sights: Bakugo. Izuku thought he had killed the boy's family because of the enraged teen's intense glare, but he knew it was all because of how he hurt Todoroki in the games, or because he was a popular figure on the internet. Yes, that was on the internet, and by now, most likely the entire school had seen it, not just his class. He turned and sighed, just in time to see Todoroki as Bakugo turned and gave him a huff. He nodded slightly to the boy, who returned the gesture, and made a mental note to speak with him after class. For a brief period, the lesson continued, and Izuku's mind continued to race with thousands of potential outcomes. Ever since he was young, he had come up with a ton of names that centered around his hero: All Might. All Might Jr., Super Might, All Man, you name it. But taking the man's name felt wrong, both because he now carried the man's power within himself and because this new power was entirely his own. Rather than giving up, he started to come up with fresh concepts related to pain, regeneration, and rising above all odds. People eventually began to stand up and give their names. Aoyama, a handsome and sophisticated boy, was the first to go up, choosing to introduce himself as though it were a very important presentation. Izuku heard criticism of the performance all around him, but the teenager chose to hold off on voicing his opinions until his identity was made public. That was promptly disregarded upon the revelation of the identity. "I can't stop twinkling. W. Was that even permitted? For example, could a hero name be the same as a brief sentence?" To everyone's surprise, Midnight accepted it, leaving them perplexed as to what could truly be called a name. Mina was next, and she strode with her typical arrogance and confidence. The heroine of Ridley Alien Queen was ultimately chosen as her hero name. It was then shot down, but Izuku couldn't help but feel bad for her because it kind of fit the theory that the girl with the pink skin had been following all along. He noticed that she had waved at him while returning, a faint dusting of lilac on her cheeks. Whatever the hell that was about, Izuku wouldn't know. Subsequently, a series of names emerged, including a commendable one from Suyu, Froppy. The heroine that kicks off the rainy season, which solidified the notion of the frog Quirk user as a kindly and clean ascetic. Izuku briefly considered the All Might idea before returning to more sensible and grounded names. This was followed by Kirishima's name, Red Riot, which was actually based off of the old hero Crimson Riot. It was a really cool naming idea. Subsequently, a lengthy list of names was presented, encompassing exceptional names like Anima, Chargebolt, and Creata, as well as more. Well, unusual names like Earphone Jack and Shoto. Bakugo sat back down after being instructed to change his from Baron of Explodo Kills, and Izuku quickly realized that Iida had left and he was alone. He had gone through a long list of intriguing and cool names based on his quirk in his head, but none of them had the desired effect on him. He had imagined that the name would strengthen and empower him while also allowing him to use it to empower others, but every single one of them just sounded weird to him. After that, Iida decided on the name Tenya, and Izuku was left in charge. And he felt it. The name that had shaped his life from preschool onwards, both positively and negatively, was extremely important to him. A name that would sound strong even in the darkest of circumstances and go well with his themes and concepts surrounding his quirk. A name that represented everything the teenager believed in and himself. Izuku got up and proudly made his way to the front of the class, holding up his name. When he finally did present it, there were a variety of reactions from people in the room. Shock, bewilderment, and laughter were all directed at him. Not even Midnight seemed sure of his decision. "Why are you sure that you are okay with that, Midoriya?" He spoke without hesitating, clenching his fist around the board. "Yay. Up until now, I've never really liked the name. It stood for me being weak and powerless and being able to be pushed down easily. But recently, someone changed the meaning of the word for me and blew my world wide open. I was so happy to be finally recognized and have the word change. It stands for getting back up, even after being beaten down so many times." His eyes darted up, catching sight of Uraraka and Bakugo in particular. Whereas the latter was enraged and glaring at him, the former had a smile of pride and contentment on her face. Izuku didn't care, though, for the first time. He grinned at what he saw written in bold letters when he turned to face his board. Deku. Izuku started idly tracing the scars on his hands beneath the linen coverings. With a focused gaze, he observed as his fingers moved over the folds in the bandages, caressing his skin until he felt the raised, jagged area of flesh feel cool and hard against his usually warm body. Somehow, knowing that his efforts would never be in vain and that he could simply look down and recall his strength, power, struggle, fragility, and downfall with a few scratches was comforting. In some small way, it even made him smile. Izuku looked around the area after he let the loud cracking sound shoot out of his fingers while interlocking them. He dragged his field of vision across the classroom and saw that most of the students were still working on their English question, which they had been working on just minutes before, when he had first started playing with his hands. Izuku had just been daydreaming for a while, allowing his mind to wander and recap what had been happening to him recently. It was just some basic translation, nothing too tough for him. For once, present Mike was silent, which helped him think clearly. The only sounds in the room were Bakugo's little groans and the sound of pencils tapping desks, which surprisingly improved the rhythm in his head. He looked out over the sea of seats again, and this time his eyes locked on Tsuyu Asui, who was staring at him with such intensity and seriousness that the boy with the green hair said he could see lightning bolts coming his way. He cocked his head, raising an eyebrow at her in the hopes that she would notice and discreetly let him know what was wrong. Rather, she saw his perplexity and just gave him a single blink, a sneer, and something written on a ball of paper that she threw at him. He was only a row behind her, so he had an easy time catching up. After taking it open, he bent forward slightly to attempt to read the scribbled writing that the frog quirk user had written. But eventually, he understood. Just attempting to determine the location of every muscle. Izuku slid back at the remark, his chair following his every move, a sickening screech echoing through his body like a pandemic of red. Peering down, he saw that his arms were bent and flexing subliminally, slightly stretching the fabric of his shirt, returning his body to its messing with bandages mode. He stammered a little and looked up to see Asui's triumphant, smirking face, her tongue sticking out of her mouth in a mocking way as she went back to her work. As he attempted to figure out what to do, Izuku was confined to the spot by the immobility of his own body. Come to think of it, he realized that a number of people had been acting strangely around him today. They had had 3 periods prior to this one, which was just before lunch. During that time, he noticed that a lot of people, both male and female, were staring at him. Initially, when he caught sight of Mina and Uraraka in homeroom, they both turned away. Then it was math, and while he was doing it, He noticed that Iida was sitting next to him, looking at his hands, and asking him about his condition, which wasn't actually all that abnormal. He also noticed that Kirishima, Kaminari, and Mineta were staring at him while they were talking in the corner of the room, with two of them glaring at him for some reason and the other one just looking confused and perplexed. Then there was the contemporary literature with Cementos, where he saw Uraraka again, this time with Momo and Jiru, who did not conceal their presence when they saw him. And Asui was there now. How was everyone today? But a brief review of his memory combined with the message on Asui's note quickly brought everything back to him, including his altercation with Todoroki and all the consequences that followed. He brought his hand to his face and sighed heavily into it. He was remembering a sad incident and was enjoying the feel of the soft linen against his skin. How it had brought him to this point. All he could think about was how the train ride home would be, or how lunch would be in a short while. He looked back down at his books and noticed the little notebook he had gotten from Recovery Girl before he departed. He took it up. There was a long list of alternate hero names that Izuku had come up with during homeroom, several names of medicines that would help with pain if he felt any, and then an even longer list of new discoveries about adrenaline. Humming to himself, Izuku smiled at his notes before raising an eyebrow once more at what was on the next page. What was inside was a vast array of ideas and tasks that he had assigned to himself. New costume ideas. He'd been thinking about how to modify his costume ever since learning about his new side effect. Yes, the change wasn't necessary because he still had one for all and was therefore still a part of All Might's quirk, but the thought of having something else of his own just appealed to him and gave him a slight thrill at having thought of some ideas. In addition, he was considering how to manage his broken bones, ensuring that they didn't cause too much of an impact on his body, even during the brief period of increased healing he experienced from adrenaline. He had considered wearing a straightforward arm brace that would hang down from his more delicate ligaments, but he eventually changed his mind, claiming that it would restrict his range of motion and that he could just rip it off when he went through his strange, devil-may-care phase, as demonstrated in his battle with Todoroki. Next, he used grips attached to his elbows, but the issues persisted. He sighed once more and leaned back in his chair, trying to figure out how to even personalize his outfit. After all, he didn't know anyone who could make significant changes to it. Hold on. Indeed, he did. He leaned up and started to recall the games, specifically the headband round and how he, Uraraka, Tokiyami, and Mei had advanced to the next round. Recalling what he knew, he could remember that she was in Class 1H and had a quirk that allowed her eyes to zoom in and out so she could see more clearly. But what caught his attention the most was how she relied on the machinery and mechanical aspects of her outfit and accessories to get her through the competition. She was the one who could assist him with his costume, if there was anyone. Memories of her telling him that she usually hung out with Powerloader at their workshop on school property came back to him, along with the fact that they had lunch after so he could go see her then. He nodded to himself and stared at the clock for the next 2 minutes, attempting to block out the sensation of eyes sweeping over his body. Ring ring, he released an involuntary sigh as he observed the other students rise from their translations, stretch, and then turn to their friends to start the banter that was a regular part of lunchtime conversation. Everyone was almost ready to leave when Present Mic quickly reminded everyone to put their papers on his desk. Izuku got up and went to the door after doing the same, saying a brief goodbye to his teacher along the way. He was suddenly very lost in the hallway now. Where was the workshop? The few remaining students turned to him in confusion as he froze in place right outside the room and turned his attention to attempting to figure out where his habit of mumbling under his breath was coming from. At the sound of his name, the boy's head shot up to meet Mina's eyes, and she asked him, Izuku? You alright? With a tone of both amusement and daze. Additionally, he quickly concluded that Toru was with her based on the floating mess of clothes that was standing next to her. Then he stood back up from his crouched position and smoothed his hands over his cracked head again, gritting his teeth in the process. Me? Oh yeah, I'm good, just trying to figure out where the workshop is. But he did not notice the slight change in Mina's yellow iris when she smirked and looked at his curled arm. He turned to his side and asked, the workshop? Why do you need to go there, Izuku? Toru was speaking now, her softer voice feeling fairly close to his ear. And sure enough, she had moved from where she had been standing next to Mina to where she was standing next to him, her skirt swishing against the sleeves of her blazer. He turned away from the invisible girl and sheepishly replied, letting a thin veil of red dust his cheeks as he spoke. Need to upgrade my costume. My new thing doesn't really work with my old suit. Mina turned to face Toru and said, oh yeah, we haven't asked you, have we? Noticing her confusion, the invisible girl shuffled back to the front of him and started to jump up and down in front of him, causing her clothes to start flying and jostling. Ask what? Oh, yeah, about that super cool, awesome thing that he did at the games. What was it, Izuku? Why did you suddenly go all raw? I'm such a badass. Huh. Well, it would take some time for me to go through it all, he said, trying not to laugh at the slight criticism of his lack of badassness. Well, I can take you to the workshop while you explain your new thing to us. Okay. The girl with pink skin who was standing next to the pair blurted out, clearly excited about his new side effect. After giving it some thought, Izuku agreed to discuss his new side effect right away, inventing a story to suggest that it was just a fresh take on a standard strength quirk in order to avoid accidentally disclosing any information about One for All. The lone boy in the group discovered that the girls were far more interested in the subject than he had realized as they were strolling along, with him flashing his outrageous hand gestures and arm waving to demonstrate his newfound powers. Izuku had not really spoken to them much over the past term, preferring to spend most of his time with Iida and Uraraka because that was usually the easiest for him. However, on the few occasions that he did speak with them, he found himself enjoying their company. Such as this moment. He was the shyest kid in the class with a quirk that he couldn't even use properly, but they were completely different from him. Both were some of the most outgoing and out there people he had ever seen in his life, and that was pretty hard to do with the constantly changing world of quirks and the like. In addition, it didn't help that he appeared to have been cut and pasted from a very plain anime background. In contrast, Toru and Mina both stood out from the crowd in different ways, such as by having no body at all or by having brightly colored bodies. He was sort of enthralled with them because they were so unlike him. They were providing him with an understanding of life that he was clearly unable to partake in at this time. As they walked, Mina muttered to herself, "So, your power practically relies on you beating yourself up to get a power-up. That's harsh, man, like real hardcore." When Izuku had finished explaining, she began to whistle. He had observed that Mina used broken-up language and slang, which was something she did not often use but which was a pleasant diversion from his typical stutter-y gibberish. "Yeah, pretty much." He laughed with her, realizing that her description was probably the most mild of them without being too graphic. "Wow. You're really cool now then, huh?" Toru interrupted to let Izuku know she was still there. "I wouldn't say that." The boy turned red as Mina leapt in front of him and started acting like an army drill sergeant, lecturing him about being cool. "Oh, come on, man. You're super cool now. You got this awesome quirk that absolutely rocks. You've got this real sweet personality, and not to mention your muscles. You are so cool, Izuku, and don't you forget it," in addition to the fact that she once again brought up his muscles. Well, it was Toru's turn to go after him. Her swaying clothes stopped abruptly to poke her finger into his upper pectorals, prodding them as if to test that they were actually real with a tone that sounded genuinely offended at the fact that he hadn't ripped off his shirt and told the whole damn class about his muscles. "Oh yay. You have all these muscles, don't ya? Where the hell have you been hiding these all this time, huh, Izuku?" And for some reason, Izuku was just stuttering and melting into a tsunami of red blushes as he tried to figure out how to get out of this predicament. But the two girls started giggling at his ineptitude, so it seemed that fate was smiling on him. Mina paused in her stride and pointed to a large, two-doored room to their left, where a lot of noise seemed to be coming from. "Ah well, here we are, muscles, the workshop," she said. It's funny he didn't see it sooner. Disregarding his earlier humiliation, he faced the two. Well, thanks for showing me here, it means a lot." He was dismissed by both of them. The girl with pink skin responded, crossing her arms under her bust, "Nah, it was no biggie, really." The invisible girl continued, her clothes swaying once more, "Yep, we're happy to help." "Seriously though, thank." Before he could answer, he noticed that the two had already run off to the cafeteria, laughing the entire way there. "Oh yeah, you ain't too worried if we tell everyone about your quirk's new shtick, right?" "No? Okay. Thanks. Bye," he exclaimed. Izuku slumped to his knees and sighed, knowing that during their hero activity last period, he would be asked a lot of questions. He walked cautiously over to the doors. He knew the girls had not just taken him to any random location in the school to make fun of his lack of social skills, but that they had actually taken him to the workshop based on the cacophony of machinery and tools coming from inside. As he approached and was ready to knock on the door, everything that had been bursting out of the room stopped abruptly. With an eyebrow raised, he was about to open the door to investigate the situation. What the whack? Izuku realized in about 5 seconds that he had been hurled clean across the hallway by an unknown force and had landed with a thud flat on his ass. With a newfound weight covering his body, He could not help but wince as his ears began to ring loudly and painfully. Aside from the doors swinging, he could also see smoke wafting through the air with narrowed eyes. His ears eventually stopped ringing in time to hear Power Loader's crackly voice. "This is why you have to be careful, god damn it. This is like the 5th time this week." Izuku tried to push himself up, shaking his head, but he found his body stuck beneath something, or rather, someone. The green-haired teen looked down and, for the umpteenth time today, felt his entire body freeze as he stared down the messy pink-haired head of someone whose softness curved and cut into his chest. In addition, he saw a pair of goggles reflecting his vision back to him in a warped mirror image before he resumed staring at his attacker. It was obvious that this individual was female, and the fact that he could feel it didn't help. Clad in an oversized tank top, work boots, and pants, the figure started to move on his lap. Izuku pushed herself up and soon found himself facing Hatsume Mei's piercing yellow eyes, the smirk on her face and the crisscrosses on her eyes a clear giveaway. Loaderbot, this is just a happy accident, cause now I know not to. Oh hey. It's you. Welcome Izuku, she exclaimed, grinning at the boy as she started to emerge from his form. Izuku received a nasty look as she did so, making him shrink back and start muttering to himself while Mei completed getting up from her human seat. He felt a hand suddenly pushed into his face. Perplexed, he stared at it. The inventor's smirk was evident in her tone when she asked, "What, you want to stay on the floor or something else?" The boy looked up to see the same smirk on her attractive face. He quickly accepted the offer. He and Mei stood there, watching the small form of Power Loader creep farther into the lab's back. He took her hand from hers and stood there whispering, "Thanks." She asked, her hands on her hips as she smirked and looked down at him. "So, what brings you to this humble abode, hey hot shot?" Yes, I'm here to discuss with you regarding a potential costume upgrade," he said, seeing her eyes brighten with interest. "Oh, and upgrade. Yeah, I see. I help you with that. Come in. The girl nudged Izuku into the workshop with a small push on his back, and then she hurried up into the shop. He looked around the room, following her lead. Izuku was surrounded by various disassembled machine and robot parts, some of which had wires and cables dangling haphazardly from them, and some of which were fully assembled models that were rotating in circles on the desk or blinking lights of various colors. This was accompanied by a great deal of loud metal banging and scrap cutting that the boy would find excruciating if he weren't one for all's owner. He eventually moved with Mei to the middle of the room. Breaking out of his daze, he said, "All right bucko, what are you looking for?" And addressed her. He raised an eyebrow at her and asked, "Well, I recently just learned about. You know, what I did at the games, right?" Oh, you mean when you went and messed that lovely body of yours up and then you got back up and screwed it up even more? If so, then I remember." He began to sigh. He gave a brief explanation of his powers and then noticed that she fell into a brief state of unconsciousness. "What I meant to ask was, so, what are you actually looking for?" It was not an easy question to answer. He simply shrugged his shoulders at her as she carried on with her thoughts. Honestly, I have no clue. I just want something to complement my powers, honestly. Maybe something to reinforce my body, I guess," she said. "You thought about braces, arm braces?" "Yeah, but they'd restrict my movement too much, and even if they weren't, I'd probably just rip them off if I get too serious." "You're correct, you did become very aggressive during that fight. How about full body armor? I have a sample if you want to give it a try," she said as she turned to leave. She swiftly brought in some robust-looking armor with thick patches and panels that would effectively shield his entire body. Mei was silently listing options in the background as he scratched the back of his head and started looking around the room for inspiration. "Looks a bit too much for me, if I'm going to be honest." He could see grips and clamps everywhere around him, but nothing sturdy. But shortly after, he focused his attention on a piece of gear that was suspended. It appeared to be a golden frame for a combat suit that resembled the one Mei had recently purchased. But this one was only a wireframe. It was straightforward. There was only one thin wire that extended down the length of the arms, bent at each elbow, and ended in a circle the size of a palm in the center of each side's hand, from which 5 more wires extended to the fingers. All it had was a metal line running down its spine. It had no legs, though. To be completely honest, it resembled the wire frame of a drawn character, a manga character, perhaps, but Izuku was drawn to a particular feature of it. He approached it and reached out to touch it, but Mei saw him coming a bit too late. "Oh, you might want to be careful of that. It has He felt something cut a piece of his linen and a few drops of blood began to pierce his skin as he came into contact with the material. Ouch! He also experienced a surge of energy and hot skin alongside this, which eventually subsided. Grasping his hand, he looked more closely at the material with his eyes. Hundreds of tiny grips and clamp-like materials composed of sharp metal were visible around the outside of the wire. Yeah, I tried to warn ya. This is a skeleton that we put inside the suits. The grips secure it to the inside of the suit and give it extra protection so they usually aren't exposed like this and they are never facing the skin. Sorry about that. Izuku then had an idea. Why, you said that these clamps and grips attach it to the suits, right? She grinned. How deep would they go if they were to go into human skin? Mei winced. If we go with the longest model, to the bone. Perhaps. He turned to Mei and spoke about his idea, his face full of inspiration and concern. To the bone, huh? That's it. In theory, these grips have the ability to stabilize a fractured bone by giving up skin in order to make contact, am I right? So, what if I had a schematic like that for my own costume? If I use my power, it will simply heal after emerging, and even the initial pain would help boost me to that initial boost of power. He noticed her worried expression as he looked up from his hand. So, in order to get your boost, would you be open to having something similar on your body? Are you certain you're cool with that? He clenched his hands and looked back at the frame. I have to do everything it takes to defeat this power and become a truly great hero. This will help me overcome this pain, he said, twisting his body as he looked directly into her yellow eyes with a conviction and determination that made Mei shudder. Can you help me do that, Mei? She hesitated for a brief moment before giggling. Alright then, hotshot, let's get to making your scar suit. Hey, not a bad name, scar suit. That hurts. Yay, metal tends to have that effect on skin. Izuku winced and grimaced at the sarcastic tone in Mei's voice as he turned away, huffing at the steel protrusions that protruded deep into his flesh from the skeleton the girl was working on. The green-haired teen just sat there as the girl in front of him worked on the mechanism that wound its way down his arm, clenching his other hand and biting his bottom lip so forcefully that he was afraid it might draw blood. The air was filled with the gentle tapping of Mei's screwdriver and the harsh gasps that Izuku had become accustomed to in the previous 30 minutes. Don't worry, hotshot, I'm almost done. Also, I recall you asking for this to be made, so don't complain, okay? Izuku turned to face her amber eyes, and as the pair's crosshairs zoomed in on his suffering, giving the Quirk inheritor the impression that they were in a standoff, it was obvious that she was sarcastically happy to be proven correct. She had marveled at how much pain he would have to go through just to put this thing on before she had even started to put the skeleton onto his body. He had foolishly said that he could take it. Which is what caused Izuku to feel foolish now. Yeah, I sharp intake of air, I know. After a few minutes, Izuku started tapping his legs with his left hand in an attempt to induce a sense of mundanity that would lessen the pain in his body and make it more tolerable. It was unsuccessful. Then, the amazing part happened when Mei stopped moving and stepped back from him while keeping a calculating gaze fixed on his innermost thoughts and placing her finger on her lips. He awaited an order. Move your arm, see how it feels. Izuku obeyed, lifting his right arm off the table he had rested it on minutes earlier. Almost at once, he felt the new weight of the metal against his body and the kinks and irritations he had to work out of his arms and joints from standing still for so long. He clenched both of his fists and leaned back to observe his second skeleton appear alongside Mei, who he could see leaning forward towards his body from the corner of his eye. Izuku was glad his friend the inventor had chosen a silver frame for him to work with. The silver stood out greatly against the pale light of his flesh, and it would stand out even more against his costume. The rack had a strange gold color that shone with pride and glory, but now that it was stained with both blood and oil that it looked like copper. Furthermore, the appendage terminated at his shoulder, leaving a stain on his skin. Its presence along his right limb served as a reminder that this would need to cover his entire torso when finished, as well as a reminder that he was not wearing a shirt. Mei had insisted he remove it so as not to damage his shirt, and had joked about his nudity on multiple occasions. With the exception of this, it resembled the racks in every way. It was a long, flexible piece of metal that snaked down his arm, supported by a second cylindrical strip that ran the length of his arm. When it reached his hand, it split into 5 separate wires for each finger, ending at the second joint, the first being the thumb. Sharp spikes protruded from the bottom of each wire and pierced his skin deeply, spaced about 20 centimeters before hitting again, leaving a ring of blood around some areas of his arm. He had long since discarded his bandages since he no longer needed them. The mechanism was not familiar to Izuku, but one feature caught his attention. A hook that wrapped around his palm and joined on the other side to form a handle he could comfortably grasp without risk of injury. Why did it exist? Not sure. He cautiously slid his hand down his forearm, experiencing a thrill when the cool substance contacted his receptors and sent a shiver down his spine. Then he came to his trek to his fingers, the metal stricture slicing over some of his skin's imperfections before he slid his metal-free hand into his infused hand's embrace and clicked the fingers that cried out for release. He sensed it as well. Hard. Because he was bending. The click made the spikes push a few centimeters deeper, leaving Izuku at their mercy. He cried out and his eyes shot open as a tiny amount of adrenaline kicked in, speeding up his body's healing around the holes in his flesh. He saw Mei flinch during that, and when she tried to move forward, he simply raised his hand to stop her. It subsided after a while, and the skin around the spikes had healed, leaving them firmly in place. Izuku laughed. Going to hurt to take them out? Yep, it will, but hey, it's not like anyone warned you or anything. The girl with the pink hair reminded him, giving him a sly smile with a hint of worry flickering in her eyes. Izuku, in spite of his pain, managed to give her a similar smile in return. Then Izuku's mind began to wrestle with this new handle. Hey Mei, what's this thing for? Lifting his hand again, more slowly this time, he pointed to the handle that encircled his right hand, his eyes questioningly wide. As she continued to consider the device's purpose, Mei tapped the screwdriver she was holding against the side of her head a few times. Her face scrunched up in a way that the boy with the green hair could only characterize as cute, which caused his face to flush slightly. Then, as she advanced her screwdriver, her eyes appeared to sparkle. Oh, that thing? Yay, I know what that's for. Izuku advanced with a bounce in her step and a slight turn of her hips, but all he did was hold out his hand dumbly as the gorgeous woman with pink hair took it in both of her hands, making the Quirk inheritor nearly helpless for the next few minutes as she gripped his fingers. Now this is a fancy little thing that I came up with to help the whole Paintron idea that you have, so you should be thanking me. She glanced down, stealing a glimpse from his agitated stare, and her face lit up as her fingers slowed down on his palm, creating swirls and circles on his bare skin. The adolescent with green hair surmised that she was trying to amuse herself as well as make him feel uncomfortable. And only after he had turned his attention from his flushed features to the person in front of him did that thought escape him. I'm going to take your awkward mumbling as a thank you, Mei, for being the best inventor in the world and for gifting me this incredible thing that will help me completely obliterate my body. You know, when I say it like that, this sort of seems like a bad thing. Izuku decided that the floor was pretty interesting right then, and that same sly smile came across her face again. But then Mei started to laugh softly, saving him from more trouble. Now what does this handle do, you may ask? Well, this handle controls how far the spikes dig into your skin. Izuku felt the constant pain shooting through his arm start to fade as she leaned down and gently cupped the handle before pushing it back towards his palm. At that moment, he chose to look down and watch as the spikes started to retract upward, coiling in on themselves to become only inanimate objects that didn't always hurt. This might seem insignificant to some, but to Izuku, it was a huge deal. Wow, Mei, I never thought about that sort of thing before. Yay. Well, I thought that you wouldn't want 2 centimeters long pieces of steel entering your body at all times. Only at certain times. One thing I have to tell you though is to not pull too hard on the handle. You know, not too hard away from your palm, I mean. His eyes were bewildered as he looked at her. Sigh, let me just show you. Prepare for some more pain, by the way. Wait, what? Izuku felt the spikes instantly re-emerge into his flesh as she wrapped one of her tiny, delicate hands around the handle and pulled it back towards her. His teeth started to grind on his tongue again, and his left hand clenched and curled in on itself in a sort of recoil effect. Mei was pulling on the handle the entire time, looking at herself with a mixture of guilt and annoyance. I'm sorry about this, Izuku, I really am, but I'm a show not tell kind of girl, you know? Why, yay, sharp intake, I understand, don't worry about it. A few streams of crimson leaked off the green-haired boy's arm and dropped to the floor below when the pink-haired student eventually reset the mechanism to prevent the spines from penetrating his body. Izuku kept huffing and moaning at the relief of his pain, but Mei cautiously stepped back to assess the condition of the boy and the machine in front of her. Well, thank you, Mei, this will really Give me a sec, need to adjust something. Suddenly, the engineer approached him and placed his arm in a straight, horizontal position before sitting on the only chair that was available, Izuku's lap. She settled her body on top of him and seemed content to keep fiddling with the mechanism, giving not even a faint murmur of explanation for what she was doing to the Quirk inheritor or the way his body had essentially shut down in a sea of red. He experienced extreme anxiety, incoherence, and warmth. Something about her body pressing against him seemed to just warm, with a sense of her being there for him. Even though it was just a simple embrace, for someone like Izuku, who was frequently perceived as a social outcast due to his quirklessness, social awkwardness, and long list of odd and wonderful traits, any positive interaction with people made the boy feel warm and content on the inside. To be honest, he hadn't felt much physical affection either, so this was new for him. That sentiment, though, didn't do anything to calm his raging hormones right now. Izuku was thrown into a flurry of stammering and blurting out the few words he could manage, but all he could do was stare blankly at the girl who was oblivious to him and kept working on the mechanism as if he hadn't even arrived. And she continued to be that way for a while, prior to. You know, this seat is actually really comfortable. I might try finding one for my home, you know? Don't worry, I'm just messing with you. I'll be a few more moments hot shot, so just keep your hormones under control for a little bit longer. He could not help but focus on the simple fact that she was sitting close to him, in fact, sitting on him, even after she had admitted it to him. Although it seemed to come from a poorly written web story or a terrible romantic comedy, he couldn't help but admit it. Since he was bare-chested, he could feel every curve of her back pressing against him. The only thing holding the two pieces of flesh apart was the thin veil of her tank top. And from this angle, and from his deep height above the girl, he could see right into her front, which was almost a blessing and a curse at the same time. Ultimately, everything was planned to elicit jitteriness and anxiety in Izuku and done. Mei jumped up from her perch with a spring in her step and spun around to give the boy a mischievous, curious look in her amber eyes. How does it feel? I tightened the coils in the upper arm layer to give you more traction, make it feel lighter, and make moving around easier. It's kind of neat, huh? He simply nodded, his face still red as his gaze lingered on his silver skeleton. Carefully, he raised his arm and sensed that the weight pressing down on his limbs had eased a little, giving it greater range of motion. Raising his head again to meet Mei's cold, hard gaze, he gave her a half smile. Yes, I do feel much better now, I'm grateful. One pink-haired girl gave him a similarly kind smile in response, and her cheeks flushed a little. Well, that's okay. It helped you with your abilities and let me test out some new technology, so it worked out well for us both. Now that classes are about to resume, isn't it time for you to put your muscles back into your shirt? Naturally, I don't mind. It's just that some people these days can get so envious. He removed the mechanism that was now attached to his arm, but as he did so, it caught his skin and caused him to sigh and moan as the metal pricked him. Mei, on the other hand, continued to giggle at him. Despite her obvious sarcasm and intent to embarrass him, Izuku fell for it anyway, falling for her alluring expression and smirk. Guess I'll have to get used to this sight as well then. He was supposed to say this quietly, but it seems he wasn't quiet enough because Mei stopped moving and began to stare at his form as if he had two heads, a common occurrence in modern times. From that fleeting glance, he could see the confusion and panic in her yellow eyes, the color of sunshine piercing his innermost being as he felt a wave of emotions submerge him in their embrace. Sorry, Izuku, don't worry about it. Just keep in mind that your body can handle a little bit more right now, so you don't have to shoulder everything. Mei approached him as she spoke, maintaining eye contact the entire time, no swagger, sass, or snark, just genuine care. And their gaze remained fixed on each other as she spoke of her desires for his powers for a while until Izuku felt a certain warmth surrounding his hand. He broke the silence and looked down to see the pink-haired girl gently and smallly running her hands over the cuts and scars on his hand, getting some of his blood on her fingers, not that she cared, which, if she was being honest, felt really nice, warm, and comforting. Hurtful. Oh, for what purpose was that? As it happened, she had decided to flick his recently healed arm during the moment she had taken him into her arms. He wasn't sure why, but she had done it, and it hurt. Hotshot. Just trying out a theory, please be calm. I'm not sure if Nurse Lady, Recovery Girl, informed you this, but it appears that after healing, your skin becomes extremely sensitive. Avoid having anyone touch it during that time to avoid excruciating pain. That also applies to your suit, which will hurt even more, really, like a motherfucker. Izuku could only smile, chuckling at her as she made some strange hand gestures in front of his face. When did you graduate from medical school? She grinned. At the time of your inquiry, hotshot. He trembled. When did I ask you that question? Don't worry, you didn't do it. Then why? Just one more thing, though. You said you had no idea when your thingamajig turned on. If we use this limb as an example, it seems to activate when self-inflicted pain or injury would render a normal person crippled. I hope that makes sense. Despite providing Izuku with quite serious information that made her shudder, she simply shrugged indifferently. Thanks, I guess. Well, you're going to be late for class if you don't get going. What was your actual last period? Mei started questioning the teenager as she saw him get up from his desk and go get his shirt, which she might or might not have tried to hide. Hero training, I believe. After putting on his shirt and fastening it with the buttons, he went to get his tie, but Mei managed to arrive before him. Let me. Without saying anything more, the short girl flipped up his collar and swung the tie around his neck before starting to tie it. The fact that Mei was touching his body during the time it took to tie his tie was something Izuku noticed, but he didn't really hate because it was the third time in about 10 minutes that the girl had been this close to him. It was all just a little overwhelming. Ultimately, though, she grinned and gave him a small pat on the chest to wrap up her services. Finished. Go to class now and stop staring. Shaking his head, Izuku picked up his bag and started to leave, but not before asking for one more thing. She laughed, pushing the boy backwards and toward his bag as she spun on her heels and began to saunter away, a sway in his hips and the same swagger, sass, and snark radiating off her form as she went. Hey Mei, is it okay if I return tomorrow? I want to run by with a couple new costume ideas that I have. She smiled heartily at him to end his leave, popping her head back from the mech she had started working on. Yes, Izuku, sure. See you tomorrow. Hold on a moment. She disappeared for a moment, then reappeared from her machine to hurl the mechanical skeleton they had been working on at the teenager, who stumbled and flailed when he saw the machine. After a moment of confusion as he stared at the device, Izuku realized that she must have picked it up when she was watching him a few minutes earlier. Well, what's the catch? Grinning once more, she began to wave Izuku away and leave the workshop. What? Go ahead and beat it. I gave you your scar suit. You're stealing all of my attention away from my babies, and I have to tend to them. The boy with green hair started to walk away, shaking his head at her change in demeanor. Oh okay then, bye Mei. See ya hot shot. Working with Izuku was strange. He had been awkward and had fumbled over everything while she had worked on him, but he was also really brave to even have the idea to go through with this sort of thing. Brave or stupid, that is. As the heavy doors of the workshop closed before her, Mei felt herself let out a fierce sigh as her face and body flushed red. With a finger tracing the side of her enormous mecha, the pink-haired girl withdrew to the seat that the boy had occupied only minutes before. There were a few drops of blood on the seat and the floor beneath her, and it was enough to make her nervous but not scared. Was he prepared for this, or had this new quirk power set confused him enough that he believed he could handle this kind of pain all the time? The truth is, she didn't know and she was certain she wouldn't find out until tomorrow. With her back to the chair's steel frame, Mei studied and examined her hand, a few drops of the green-haired self-destroyer's blood drying on her knuckles and fingers. She sighed again, running her delicate fingers over the skin. I hope you know what you're doing, Izuku, I really do. Ring ring. Izuku began to slowly move toward the changing room's door, using the wall as support as he did so while panting heavily. The changing rooms are on the other side of the school from the workplace, so he had to run when he heard the warning bell cast a deafening shadow over the school a few minutes ago when he had started walking from Mei's workshop. Apart from the fact that he looked pretty foolish running past groups of students to get to class, Izuku noticed that quite a few people were staring at him strangely. Perhaps this was because he was running, but he had noticed the stares from before he even started, groups of people who started to bore into his very being when he walked by, ceasing any kind of conversation they had been engaged in to instead whisper in quiet, illegible tones. Some of them showed curiosity in their gaze, others showed anger and jealousy, and some simply appeared oddly attracted to his figure as he hurried down the hallway, though that could have just been his imagination. When he finally made it to the door, he watched, exhausted, as it swung open and into the male changing room. Even from outside the room, noise just exploded all over his stagnant and frozen form, from the quiet murmurs of the girls on the other side of the wall to Bakugo's loud cursing to Iida's and what appeared to be Minetta's disciplinary shouts as he tried to do. Well, it was definitely something to do with the girls. Izuku couldn't help but sigh. It seemed like just another ordinary day at UA. Once again, luck was not on his side as he made his way into the changing room and attempted to draw as much attention away from himself as possible, concentrating on getting to practice in time and also catching his breath. Izuku, since you're usually among the first people here, where have you been? Twisting his head, He saw the speedster standing behind him with a quizzical gaze in his eyes. He relented, throwing his tie to the bench, and the eccentric and over-the-top voice of Iida spoke out behind him as he started to take off his top for the second time that day. "Just working on some stuff, Iida, nothing really to worry about." "My friend, if you are certain." Izuku laughed a little at his friend's behavior and went back to putting on his hero outfit, but as he was about to do so, he stopped and looked down at it. He felt ashamed of it. The protrusions at the top of the hood, which were supposed to resemble All Might's hair, looked goofy and stupid to the point where they had been mistaken for bunny ears more than once. The tacky mask with a fake smile painted on it looked more like a cosplay than anything useful. The inappropriate padding and cartoon mascot-like gloves just seemed off-putting and tacky. Holding it in his hands, Izuku began to smooth over some of the creases with his fingers, and as the scarred pieces of flesh came into view, his eyes narrowed slightly. Yes, this was the power of All Might, of All for One, but now his new thing had activated and he was drifting ever further away from All Might, and to be honest, that was okay. If he was going to be the best hero that he could, he needed to be unique and needed to differentiate himself from someone like All Might, yet his costume didn't speak this. Instead, it spoke of a mere imitator of the actual thing, of a faker trying to be All Might with cheap tricks and plastic. All of these thoughts got ideas plaguing Izuku's mind, ideas of whether or not he could be the new symbol of peace after All Might, if this was really meant to be, or in actuality he was meant for something different. Hell, his new powers seemed to dictate that, after all, who would want to look up to someone that needed to cause harm to themselves in order to save the day? No. Izuku, huh? Glancing down, he saw that he had fully clothed himself in his costume before glancing over to his right to see Uraraka, likewise in her costume, staring at him anxiously. The green-haired boy snapped out of his trance-like state once more and realized that he was outside in the cityscape area that they had used in the first training session as well as the entrance exams. What's not right? Nothing, you were just sort of spacing out is all. Shrugging her shoulders, the shorter girl pivoted on her heels and headed back towards the front where All Might and Aizawa were positioned. Looking down, the green-haired boy saw the metallic scar suit gripped between his right and left hand, hidden from the view of those around him, and felt one of the grips cut through the cloth of his gloves, causing a wave of crimson to begin poking out from his skin. Yet he did not do anything to cover it, he just let it grow and expand until a large drop fell from grace and hit the earth with an audible splash. Despite this, he continued to look forward, even as Uraraka turned to look at him in confusion. "If we could have your attention, please." Izuku and the other students in his class turned back to face their teacher and rested their eyes on the forms of Eraserhead and All Might. "Today we have a test for you, one like the test that you took part in during one of the first days at the academy, a classic heroes versus villains fight." Somehow, Aizawa got that out before All Might, who was far more demanding, interrupted him. "Students, young people, just like in your first hero lesson, you will be working on exercises in groups of heroes and villains today. But this time, rather than pursuing a gadget, you'll be using your quirks to free a hostage, who just happens to be one of your classmates, by using..." I just said that. Peering around the group of students, he noticed that some were clueless about what to do, particularly Bakugo, who appeared to be quite let down by his role as savior hero for once. "Now, we will choose who will be paired up as heroes, as villains, and who will be acting as the hostage." After a while, Aizawa and All Might had chosen the choice, and Izuku stood in silence for a few minutes, letting the world around him suck his whole form into itself as noise and shuffling of other students caught his eyes and ears in distraction, which he was actually pretty happy of. "Alright. Team A will be Bakugo and Tsuyu as the heroes versus Kaminari and Koda as the villains with Mineta as the hostage." Izuku stood there, taking in the emotions that were coursing through the room. He saw Bakugo walk off, a dejected-looking Tsuyu trailing him, while Kaminari simply shrugged and wandered over to his partner, who, well, looked kind of happy to be with someone like Kaminari and Mineta. Izuku laughed as he turned to go back into the waiting room, but then a big hand slapped him on the shoulder, and he swiveled his head, seeing his mentor's enduring smile. "Young Midoriya. Hey All Might. Hey, are you sure you can participate in battle with you and your whole new top secret thing?" "Yes, I'll be alright. I appreciate your concern nonetheless." "Don't worry. That's what I do." With All Might at his side, he walked back down and toward the hall, waiting for a long moment before he saw the giant's head turn down to look upon his arms, where his mechanical skeleton was kept. Turning around, Izuku could tell that the man was unsure about it, and with a sigh, the team gave in. "I was just working on some experimental technology during lunch. Now that it's a certainty rather than a random chance, it should aid me in achieving adrenaline activation and enable me to use its powers. Previously, I didn't know how much damage I needed to take before it activated. Unaware that the boy had started to mumble under his breath, Yagi was left staring at him with a thin layer of acceptance and confusion clouding his judgment. All right, young Midoriya, I believe I comprehend, as long as you handle it with knowledge. Frowning at the sight of the boy's injured and scarred hand, which would remain with him forever, etched into his skin as a reminder of his first activation for the rest of his life, the pro-hero returned his successor's smile with his own, but he couldn't help but feel a little cautious at the device Izuku now held. It looked sharp and dangerous, something that could activate his powers while still hurting him. He shook his head, realizing the group had arrived at the observation room. Izuku stood quietly by Uraraka and Iida as they talked to other students in the class, such as Kirishima and Toru, just letting them all talk and dulling his senses to the outside world. Because of his quirkless nature, he hadn't had much reason to speak in school for fear of being shut down, so he just learned to listen to others and found it to be quite relaxing. Speaking wasn't his best ability, but he enjoyed noise, and other people talking did just that. For a brief while, it was just the preparation phase, so everyone in the room remained stagnant and nervous, resorting to light chat and conversation to get through. Releasing a light sigh, he heard everyone around him quieten and shift towards the screens at the front of the room. There, it broadcast the beginning of the match between the two teams, with one screen showing the heroes awkwardly standing around while the other two showed a cowering Mineta and the two villains making small talk with each other. Overall, the atmosphere seemed relatively calm. Then, the siren rang. Suddenly, both teams were thrown into action, with Bakugo rushing forward into the desolate building that they were fighting in while Asui started to climb the building. It was a smart tactic. Whether it was intentional or not was another story, but flanking the enemy from both sides and grabbing the hostage in the chaos was smart. And to their credit, that's what the heroes did. Bakugo rushed in head first and stormed the two unprepared heroes who tried to fight back, but it just ended with the two of them lodged into the wall. Well, Kaminari was, while Koda just looked down at him in worry, while Asui grabbed Mineta and left. Heroes 1, Villains 0. The next team was composed of Momo and Todoroki as villains and Shoji and Siro as heroes, with Toru as the hostage. As a result, the match was a peculiar game of cat and mouse, with both sides trying to locate the girl who was restrained in order to either rescue her or protect her. Ultimately, the timer defeated everyone, and the villains won that round. After a while, Izuku stopped counting and allowed the vivid colors and striking surroundings to take over his vision as his mind descended into a black hole. Occasionally, he would see different student matchups and their characteristics, but other than that, he would just let his body unwind for a short while. Throughout the day, he had been too nervous or too excited about himself to take a step back and unwind a little, and he succeeded in doing so. With Uraraka as the hostage, will be Midoriya and Ishido versus Kaminari and Sato. Arrive at your locations. Shaking his head, he felt a tiny tug on his sleeves and followed it to find Mina staring at him with a quirked eyebrow. In fact, he got so engrossed in his own world that he missed out on most of the matches, only tuning in for his own matchup. Izuku. You alright, dude? He shook his head again, blinking a couple of times at her question before answering. Why, yay, I'm good, don't worry. The girl with the pink skin grinned. Alright. Come on, get moving or we won't have time for the villain beatdown. It's about time I gave Kirishima a lesson. Izuku couldn't help but laugh lightly at her as they started walking down the hallways and toward the arena. Mina was a strange girl in every sense of the word. Her appearance included pink skin, horns, and two very strange-looking eyes that, while not all that uncommon when combined, still looked quite out of place. Her personality, on the other hand, was quite foreign to his laid-back and shy nature, and although it was new and unusual, Izuku found Uraraka's bubbly personality refreshing and new, and she was still able to appreciate her appearance, even going so far as to call her pretty or beautiful despite the strangeness that most people focused on. This wasn't something he should be focusing on right now, though. After arriving at the building, the hero pair had to wait again while they got ready. Mina spun around to meet him, having to look up a little because the boy was about 2 to 3 inches taller than her. Well, Muscles, what have you got for me? We fly over the top, storm the fort. Oh, burrowing beneath. He had to laugh again at her flamboyant demeanor, but she did have some points. She mentioned that storming the building's front could be a good idea because he and she could use their powers to distract Kirishima and Sato long enough to drag Uraraka out. However, since both of them have quirks that either increase or contribute to their strength, Mina could be easily subdued. She also mentioned that sneaking around could be a good idea, but it could backfire if they were cornered. Peering over their heads, he calculated the building's height and saw that it was about 4 stories high, Based on the other matches, the villains and hostages were typically concentrated on the top floor of the complex, so launching a surprise attack from the air would give them the advantage of time and resources to eliminate them and free Uraraka. Mina, you're alright with heights, right? Yes, I suppose. Why did you inquire? Oh, are we going up? Sort of. He stepped back, eyeing the mechanical limb he was holding. Now to put it on. Grabbing the right sleeve of his costume, he tugged it roughly down his arm until he heard it rip and the material collapse down towards the concrete. Flexing the limb a few times to make sure it was okay to use and had no kinks, he briefly saw Mina's face flurry lilac at the sight of his exposed flesh and how it tensed and flexed. However, a sly smirk also managed to appear on her face. Izuku, I don't mind at all seeing all of that, but why did you do that? The green-haired boy gave her a gentle smile as he answered her question with emotion, hauling the steel device up and towards his free arm and then starting to strap it down to his skin and slide his fingers through the handle. Ensuring that it was securely around him, the teen took a deep breath as his body started to shake in harsh anticipation of the sharp pain that was about to come. Sorry if this annoys you, if what? Izuku bit his tongue and then pulled the device's handle back hard as soon as the siren's harsh sound echoed throughout the arena. The boy did not stop screaming as the cool steel barbs instantly injected themselves into his flesh and buried themselves deep, causing a flash flood of pain to shoot through his body. Oh my god. Fuck. Throwing himself into the steel railings behind him, the teen just began to grunt and curse as he gripped his arm for support and the adrenaline began to surge around his whole form. Shuddering and shaking with the new flush of power that began to shoot through his veins, he just looked forward with complete resolve while the world pulsated and shook in sharp pitches of red and blue, buildings and shapes shifting into a new color spectrum for a few short moments before ceasing. Beside him, he could hear Mina's worried voice, her frantic movements as she shook him, her concerned look and pleading face right before his eyes, and for a split second, he could see her as a normal girl. Pale skin, light blonde hair and green eyes that wouldn't stand out too much in this quirked world, but to Izuku it reminded him of himself, of how he was so plain and useless before. How he had to embrace his quirk and give it all the attention it deserved. Soon, his labored breathing began to slow and he managed to look Mina in the eye and hear her worries. Izuku, man, for heaven's sake, are you listening? He grinned and said, she was worried because she cares, or at least that's what he hoped. Reaching up, he gently touched her exposed shoulder, taking care not to hurt her skin. Hey, how are you doing? Be at ease regarding. As he stood up again, gritting his teeth, he could still see the worried expression on the face of the teenager in front of him, her mouth hanging open and her eyes wide. What? What in hell was this? Not at this moment. Are you still comfortable climbing? He stopped her questioning and received a slow nod in return. Good. Then, in an instant, he shot forward, the feeling of cracking in his ankles still present, before winding his arms around Mina so that he was carrying her. It happened so quickly that the girl couldn't really comprehend what was going on, with her face stained lilac and her eyes and mouth wide again before Izuku just looked down at her and smiled. He mashed his right digits together into a fist, feeling the intensity of the skin and its heat as lightning and sparks of red crackling and shooting off around him. Don't worry, I've got you, and she gave him credence. Jumping lightly on the spot to gain some momentum, Izuku then shot off, the sound of mending in his bones stopping for another round of cracking. The duo soared through the air with blinding speed, constantly being barraged by Izuku's sparks of crimson that marked the air with their crackling. Tightening his grip on Mina's body, Izuku began to coordinate where he was going to land and how much force he would have to exert in order to break through the concrete ceiling. Sucking in his teeth, he made a quick, split-second decision and rolled when he hit the floor. Wrapping Mina tight into himself as he did in order not to hurt her, the green-haired teen winced as his landing caused a multitude of cracks and sharp edges to emerge all over the building, with the small crevasse slowly catching up to his moving form. Finally, as he finished he let go of the pink-haired girl, and soon the two were standing upright, facing one another. Izuku looked around, noticing that they had passed a window on their way up here, and he knew from the previous recordings that the hostages were typically kept close to it or in a different room away from the villains. He started to speak, but as he did, he noticed that Mina's cheeks were a deep lilac color. Raising an eyebrow, he started a quiet conversation with her so as not to alert the others below. What's going on? Huh, oh no, that's nothing to worry about. Although she gave him a broad, convincing smile, Izuku just kind of shrugged it off, and her cheeks continued to turn purple. Just let me know if anything is, okay? If you say so. With a small smile, she expressed her gratitude. All right. I think I know what I'll do now. I'll come in from this side, drop down directly on top of them, and you can use the top window we passed over there to sneak down and find Uraraka. If you need advice, I would suggest using hydrochloric acid to dissolve the wall so that you can climb up, but only go a short distance because, given your acidity, if you left it there long enough, it would corrode right into the room. He had started babbling again, and Mina saw this as her chance to exact revenge for making her feel ashamed, even though she wasn't. Have you been writing notes about me, Izuku? And she got exactly the response she was hoping for. His eyes widened, his face burned and heated up, and he stopped talking incoherently about the plan, just muttering. I can explain. Yes, we must follow your incredible plan, so go ahead and do it later, muscles. She walked toward the enormous floor crack and toward the edge of the building, putting a certain swing in her hips along the way, smirking to herself that she knew what she was doing to the poor boy without even looking at him. When she eventually arrived, she spun around and met Izuku's gaze, which had moved to the other side of the roof where he was preparing to break in. Without breaking eye contact, she started to walk backwards while saluting him. Be alert, quick, and powerful. All the boy could do was give a pitiful shake of his head as he cracked and reset his knuckles before charging them full of all for one and smashing them down onto the concrete below him, causing the figments and fractures to come apart at his feet and fly around his form as he started to fall into the dimly lit room below. That was all she left Izuku with before she fell off the side of the building, screaming as she went down. It did not take long for Izuku to reach the surface, and he immediately rolled back into a crouched position, surveying the room with a calculating eye. Based on what he could see, Kirishima and Sato appeared to be focused on the window where Mina had just fallen, likely drawn there by her screams, and had not turned to face him. Beside them, Uraraka lay wrapped in a thick metal cable, much stronger than the ordinary rope that they usually used to tie up fictitious hostages. At that moment, Izuku realized that the entire situation revolved around his and Mina's quirks. His strength could easily rip the wires off, but that could cause some difficulties if there was anything inside, and even that could cause issues if Mina wasn't cautious enough. Izuku took advantage of his classmates' stunned states and launched himself forward, stopping just in front of Sato's body and leaping over him, landing hard on his head and then spinning around until he was face to face with the bewildered boy. He then repeated this move, spinning around until he could kick Sato in the face with his foot that wasn't powered up by One for All, sending the sugar quirk user hurtling toward the closest wall. As he landed, he noticed that Kirishima had started to turn around and had used his hardening quirk. Knowing that his quirk would shield him once more, Izuku just leapt forward, slamming his fist into the back of Kirishima's head, sending the boy sprawling to the ground and causing a plethora of cracks to appear around his red hair. Gritting his teeth, he reset his arms and knuckles as he moved past the fallen enemies and in the direction of the window, catching a glimpse of Uraraka in the reflection, seeing only her stunned and shocked expression, which made him laugh. But before he knew it, Sato had wrapped his hand around his torso and flung him backwards toward the dry wall at the back of the room. Izuku had to right himself after crashing painfully into the floor once, landing back in a crouched position with his foot touching the wall. Looking up, he saw Sato rubbing his head, and Kirishima was doing the same, blurting out a few words and mumbling before turning to face him. Both of them stood to their full height, and the quirk inheritor cracked his knuckles, grinning alongside Kirishima. Damn Izuku, that was a pretty good punch. I can see why you could take down Todoroki. Thanks. Pushing his hand down, he wrapped it around his mechanism's handle before pulling it, causing a small jolt of pain to push forth into his system. Biting his tongue, he felt that new pain alongside the pain from hitting both people before him and his rolling fiasco a few seconds ago flood his system and cause a bright array of crimson sparks to come flying off his form, blinding the area around him in a scarlet light. Ignoring the stunned views of both of his opponents, his eyes instead drifted to Uraraka who, while also holding a large amount of curiosity and pride in her eyes, also held worry and concern. Glancing down, he could only offer her a sympathetic smile as he saw a small trail of blood begin to fall from the first two holes in his arm, trailing down his wrist like a small stream. Shrugging that thought from his mind, he shot himself forward again, meeting Kirishima squarely. The two quirk users smirked at each other again, feed each other's fists with their own, creating a small shockwave to be exerted from their force. Running his knuckles up the red-haired boy's own, he felt the metal of his metallic limbs scrape against his skin like steel on steel, throwing his hand above his head and allowing his to give him a rough shove that sent him flying back a few feet. Centering himself again, Izuku threw up his left arm in preparation for Sato's own attack, which struck him like a truck and sent him flying to the right a few feet, holding his footing, He eventually managed to push him back with a shoulder charge, shooting into his chest and sending him backwards, stumbling over his own 2 feet. Izuku. Hello. Why didn't you begin without me? He turned to face Mina, who was shaking her head and staring down at Kirishima's body with an unusual amount of sarcasm and sass in her voice. Mina, do you think you can melt through Uraraka's thick metal wires that surround him? Yes, I believe I can, but why don't you just take advantage of them? They wouldn't have put that there unless they had something inside them that could hurt me or her if I pulled it off, so you're the safer option. Ah, I see. Okay, then cover me. When she got close to Uraraka, she winked at him and walked over Kirishima's chest, making him groan in pain. Izuku sighed and turned on his heel, hearing Sato get up from the floor next to Kirishima. Hey Sato, take care of Izuku. I'll go get Mina. Gotcha. It worked, sending Sato careening a few floors below them, hitting the earth with a thud and a moan. Gritting his teeth, Izuku bit his tongue hard to spark a small amount of pain from his system before charging his fists with one for all infused with adrenaline as he charged forward towards Sato, who was woefully unprepared for him, and smashed him on the back with a sickening crunch coming from his hands afterwards. Izuku, who had momentarily lost himself in the agony, heard Kirishima shuffling as he stood and made his way towards Mina, the girl whining and jesting at him along the way. Turning on his heel, he ran after the man and called out to the acid user. Mina. The floor beneath him was acidic. Well done, muscles. Muscles? Izuku ignored Uraraka's agitated cry and watched as Kirishima clipped on a wave of thick turquoise liquid, falling forward before Izuku arrived. Channeling his power again, he moved in front of Kirishima, roaring as he caught both of his fists under the hardening user's chin, sending him through the roof and sky high. Huffing and inhaling deeply, he could hear the 2 girls behind him go silent for a moment. Holy shit. Izuku cracked his knuckles and then started to hop off several pieces of debris that were all over the place, launching himself towards the hole. After waiting there for a short while, he challenged one for all once more and managed to grab hold of the Red Riot. For a split second, everything was silent, but then Izuku swung Kirishima around and launched the hardened boy down through the building and towards the ground at incredible speeds, shattering the foundation and hitting the floor with a thud. Izuku landed on his knees, hissing in brief pain as it flared up in his legs, but he could already feel adrenaline healing his wounds quickly before fading. The pain was gone, and as he cradled his hand and pushed the handle back towards his palm, he felt the spikes on his devices retract, sucking back into the metallic creation. He looked to the side and saw Uraraka and Mina, who had now been freed, staring at him with a range of emotions. He shuffled backwards until he hit a wall and slumped down, sighing as he did so. Reaching down, he started to remove the small straps of wires holding the device to his arm, and he watched as it fell to the concrete with a metallic ping. Despite this, he could still feel the blood pooling around his knuckles and dripping onto the floor with soft thuds, as he ran his left hand down his arm. Well, that was a successful test run. Izuku never looked up from the floor. He remained motionless even when he heard footsteps approaching him, when Uraraka knelt beside him, when Mina sat next to him at the wall, or when the gravity quirk user took his bloodied and scarred hand and ran her delicate fingers over each raised piece of hardened flesh or drop of blood. He only glanced at them both when he felt her fingers tighten their grip on him and her voice faltered. Izuku, you owe us an explanation. Right now. Could loneliness exist in a quirked world? Could something so basic as loneliness, a problem that can be so readily resolved by kindness and companionship, even exist in a world where people can change their genetic makeup at will, where people can fly on their own initiative, and where people with extra limbs or body parts are common? Indeed, it did. Izuku tapped his fingers softly on the wooden desk, and felt the faint echoes bounce and race across the space. He wasn't really sure how his thoughts had strayed onto this subject. Nothing particularly alarming had occurred to cause him to doubt the basis of civilization, nor to accuse the quirked world of a grave crime or even to consider its meaning in general. Therefore, why was he thinking this way? He started to notice the bandages that were firmly wrapped around his arms, snaking down his flesh like linen serpents that choked and smothered his dead and crippled flesh away from society, as he looked down at his fidgeting fingers. Perhaps that was the reason he started to think. He was isolated along with All Might and the other one for all users, trapped within the stigma and the gross oversimplification of the world, that their combined and crystallized power couldn't and shouldn't be possible. It was a secret that they must all keep to their graves because it put the very world into scale that they would not be able to escape from if the truth came out. These scars, the ones the bandages were hiding from the world, were caused by his quirk, the power passed on to him by another person without blood or heritage involved. He felt alone in that sense since he couldn't discuss and reveal his secret to people who genuinely cared about him. He knew in his heart that it wasn't that, though. He was not alone in that situation because there were people he could talk to about his feelings. People like Recovery Girl and even All Might. People who had to go through all the same things he was going through now. In fact, it must have been much harder for them in a world where people were becoming accustomed to the idea of powers and innate abilities ingrained in the human genome. Therefore, that was not what caused him to reflect. It might have been the relentless burden that the acceptance of the quirk placed upon him. After all, even the users who came before him had not been forced to adopt the role of the symbol of peace, or the ideology of all might. Yes, they had embraced the quirk and the abilities it bestowed, but to the best of his knowledge, the man who had given it to him had used it to rise to prominence in the heroes' society. In fact, to such an extent that the island of Japan appeared to wish him luck as hordes of people prayed to this cutting-edge, superhuman god. And Izuku had to live up to that? The teen was sitting here with the fate of the hero community in his shaky, scarred hand. In that sense, he was truly alone, having previously been so overcome with worry and desire for the man's quirk that he hadn't really considered the consequences of his actions. Even so, the impossibly high odds he faced were shared by others of a similar caliber, as individuals such as Todoroki and Bakugo were pushing themselves against both heaven and hell to claim the top spot, as well as against forces like Endeavor and fate itself. Then maybe it was just his peculiarity, the adrenaline. Its basic basis was pure anguish and rage at the idea that in order to use even a small amount of power, the user would have to make a sacrifice of blood, releasing vast amounts of stored energy and force on top of the power bestowed by one for all. It was a really wonderful side effect, and if it was taken too far, it might even be a whole other quirk, but that's where the society's and the future's ideologies collided. Izuku used to absolutely adore All Might when he was younger. He still does, but the main reason was that he seemed unbreakable. Izuku used to watch All Might fight villains all the time, save people, and bat away problems like they were nothing. He exhibited his strength and stoicism in everything he did, and his smile demonstrated that he had no fear of chaos or death. That's why Izuku and a lot of other people looked up to him. However, how could he continue to inspire the next generation when he would have to bleed after every attack and every time he jumped in to save someone? That alone demonstrated how weak he was, that he couldn't even save himself, let alone a hostage or someone in danger. That's where he was by himself. It wasn't the first time he had experienced loneliness. There were drawbacks to being quirkless, but he was now fully embraced. Deku. Izuku was startled out of his stupor by the verbal bullet and realized that he was being questioned by his classmates in their classroom. His skin turned red from the intensity of the glares he was receiving almost instantly, feeling raw and hot. The impatient forms of Uraraka, Mina, Iida, Kirishima, and Toru surrounded him. He understood Uraraka and Iida because they had all walked to the station together, but he wasn't in a position to question anyone around him given his circumstances. According to his guess, the invisible heroine was walking home with the pink-skinned teen who had stayed behind to investigate why her teammate had suddenly turned into a literal bloody superhuman during their training session, and the hardening hero was in a similar situation. Izuku started to quickly and vaguely remember how he got into this situation. He was feeling lightheaded and dizzy after his fight with Kirishima and Sato, so he tried to return as soon as he could to the waiting room. Before he did, he made an effort to ignore Uraraka and Mina's probing questions while assisting his opponents. This got him into hot water with them for not answering correctly, as well as attention from the red-headed person he assisted, who became incredibly curious about how his quirk worked. By the time he returned to the waiting room, most of his classmates were staring at him and responding with open mouths. Aizawa had essentially made the class continue by giving Izuku the bandages to cover his arms, which Recovery Girl had given him because she was aware of how unruly and uncontrollable the teen was at this stage of his training. Before he turned to face a certain Uravity and noticed the gadget firmly clasped between her fingers, he soon realized that his mechanic limb had vanished, abandoned at the training grounds. He remembered attempting to convince her to return the device to him, promising to explain everything, but Uraraka refused to give it back, stating that he needed to return to their classroom after school to pick it up. At that moment, he was practically compelled to sit down by the 5 people currently in the room. Sorry, blanked out for a few minutes. What were you talking about, Uraraka? She sighed, and he caught a glimpse of the pacing girl's fists slightly tightening out of the corner of his eye. Well, Izuku, I asked you if you would mind explain what the hell happened just now. Izuku, not Deku. Just hearing that come out of her mouth hurt him a little bit. She was the one who stood up for his demeaning nickname, the one who made the pain he felt from Bakugo's usage worthwhile, the one who stood by him, the one who successfully transformed his label as an outcast into something that meant he could stand up against the very world itself, the one who stood by him. To hear her ignore that demonstrated her anger and fury at this situation, how he was acting carelessly and out of character when it came to this whole problem. He was usually so deliberate and thorough in his decisions, but instead he was just blunders like a child hooked up to overwhelming power. She saw it, as did everyone else in the room, that he was no longer in control. Pulling on his bandages, Izuku clenched his teeth and smashed the cartilage fragments against one another, vowing to become a better person once more. He was going to fight so that Deku would be the only thing people saw in him, the person who could overcome adversity and smash any pitiful faces put in front of him, not the one who wore that title carelessly. The adolescent turned to face the anxious girl and made an effort to steel himself so he could confront her head-on without exploding out of shame or disappointment. I was trying to figure out how to best use the new aspect of my quirk. He caught the girl's pacing and shuffling. Huh? What's that supposed to mean? Kirishima was the one who asked the question this time. Tearing his eyes from Uraraka's faltering frame, he looked directly into the confused redhead's eye, using his mind to temporarily divert himself by tracing the rough scar that lay there. His quirk, duh. We did tell you about it, right? On the other side of the classroom, Mina's initial feelings were strong and confident, bordering on arrogance, but as she thought back to earlier experiences, her feelings quickly turned worried and anxious. Izuku was weighing to highlight things in his mind to avoid his rosy-cheeked friend's poignant and crippling stare, but he had no right to speak about past events for which he wasn't present. Nope. He was off doing stuff with Bakugo when we told the others. With great happiness, Toru replied, her high-pitched voice coming from the other side of the room as the chalk on the blackboard started to doodle inexplicably. The teenager with pink skin sighed. Why didn't you tell me sooner, Toru? Why? It wasn't important. If you reckon me looking sort of dumb is not important. What did you say, Mina? Forget it. Finally, Iida decides to join the conversation from the side of the room. Raising his body to face the assembly, the teenager heard the faint sound of metal hitting the ground as he moved to stand beside Izuku. The speedster's massive frame dwarfed the considerably shorter quirk inheritor. We understand your conviction, Izuku, it's what makes you, you. However, what we do not understand is why you would require so much potential harm to activate it. Iida was very direct as usual, displaying a kind of brutal honesty that almost broke Izuku's skull, but this time there was something more beneath his words. The boy with green hair looked up at the teen and was taken aback by what he saw. Iida was motionless. He was usually very erratic, constantly twitching and moving his arms, making it seem as though he could hardly stand still, but now he was motionless as a statue. Izuku was also blinded by the intense glare from his glasses, which reflected the sun that was beginning to set behind the teenagers. This was peculiar. Well, ever since my fight with Todoroki, my quirk seems to have taken on some new attributes that weren't there before, like, do you remember how some people thought their quirk was something completely different to what it actually was? Water manipulation was actually the ability to condense and transmute the oxygen in the air to be more like water due to the presence of more hydrogen atoms, stuff like that. He held back. Once more, he had been babbling. When he looked up from the desk, he saw Iida standing in front of him, nodding his head in complete understanding while the other four were still quite confused. Uraraka seemed to understand most of it, but she seemed to lose interest in the scientific aspect of it. He couldn't see Toru, but the fact that his doodling had become increasingly shaky until it was reduced to a few shaky lines had answered his questions, and Kirishima and Mina were staring at each other in morbid confusion, twirling their fingers around each other while expressions of bewildering origin consumed their faces. Before the girl with the pink skin could speak again, some time passed. Jay, just think of it as thinking your quirk is water generation when it's more water manipulation. At this point, it seemed to catch on with everyone again. So then, what's this new, awesome quirk of yours then? Kirishima posed a very good query. Because of the widely held belief that Izuku's initial strength enhancement was mysterious, they could have assumed that his powers remained unchanged. However, since the user was now dispelling this theory, what was it? This is when Izuku started to worry. He didn't have a prepared cover story for this. Previously, when he only had the one for all base quirk, it was fairly simple to pass it off as a separate strength quirk because of the complete change in appearance that occurred whenever he and All Might unleashed an attack. This was later discovered to be caused by their side effects, but he was unaware of this at the time. Even now, it was still relatively easy to pull off because All Might couldn't use pain that was inflicted upon him to amplify his attacks. The only thing that bothered him was that he had to devise the cover-up so quickly. Before it was just a simple strength enhancement quirk, a mass collection of power that I was able to summon at will with the side effect of the uncontrollable nature being the damage I received after the fact. Now it's more of my body attack itself in order to build up energy, damaging my nerves and receptors for a short amount of time with the energy given off from the start of my quirk, when my skin starts to get hot. Then, that pain generates more energy than at the initial activation, as pain is what brings about the energy required for the output, and so I can use it in a punch in my arms or I can use it in my legs to travel really long distances quickly at the cost of breaking the bones or tissue in the area that the quirk is used in. Fortunately though, the energy also activates a larger amounts of blood cells which clot the skin wounds and heal them at a much faster rate, while my bones are helped by an influx in chondroblasts which heal them faster. Looking up from his digression, he hoped he had sufficiently explained everything to not only persuade them all of his quirk. In return, he was met with looks that had him wondering if he was really speaking English at all. Even Iida appeared a little perplexed. In retrospect, my body requires pain as a stimulus to generate mass amounts of energy that fuel my body before releasing addition cells to help with recovery for a short time afterwards. Leaning back, Izuku had just about convinced himself that he was free when Kirishima, the hardening hero, leapt at him, clearly delighted at the latest revelation the green-haired teen had made. Whoa! That is so cool, you have to hurt yourself in order to use your quirk? That is so manly? The inheritor could not resist copying the broad, toothy grin that he gave Izuku when he patted him on the back. It's also really stupid and really dangerous. Izuku heaved a tiny sigh at the sight of Uraraka, looking past the teen with spiky hair and forward. Her words came out with kindness and consolation rather than hate or malice, even though her eyes were full of rage and anger mixed with moments of confusion and irritation. Overall, it was a very perplexing image that, although putting an end to the adolescent's mental image of a distressed and confused girl, also caused him to reflect on his own circumstances. He had caused her to feel all these things and force her to act in this way due to his malfunctioning quirk. Izuku looked her in the eye and opened her mouth to say something, but just then there was a sharp cough and loud shoe tapping. Now that's all fine and dandy, right? But please indulge dear Izuku, what the hell do you need with this thing then? Mina moved with the faint sound of hollow metal, practically skipping towards the group, who, for whatever reason, had all decided to gather around Izuku's desk. Izuku followed the sound to its source and felt his skin suddenly becoming hot with shame and the hot gaze of a certain gravity girl, whose whole form was somehow consumed in a reassuring rage as the pink-skinned girl drew near to them. In her hand, Mina carried his mechanical limb, his device, his scar suit. The handle jingled and shook, clashing with the device's metallic frame and producing the menacing noise that came from the girl's grasp as she inhaled sharply at the poorly written and extremely awful name. Reaching close enough to place the spindly frame on the desk, she turned to face Izuku with a look of playful terror in her eyes, knowing from the look on his face what this would mean for him. She then wiped her hands on her skirt and placed them on her hips. Go on then, what's this thingy maggage do for your quirk? Izuku blinked at the mechanism and hesitated before picking it up. So, when I was explaining my quirk, I told you all that my body needed pain to act as a stimulus for my quirk, that it allowed the release of energy which would then be used in my limbs as a source of power. I also explained that this stimulus can come from my own body, with a sort of precursor energy activating alongside it to provide pain initially so that the after effects and the primary source of energy can be used. However, at this point I don't know if that will do anything long term. I don't know if it'll damage me internally, even with the additional cells helping the recovery, or if it might damage me mentally. Think of this source of quirk activation as what happened at the UA games, during my fight with Todoroki and how I sort of lost it. He looked up at his impromptu audience to make sure they were still paying attention. Kirishima and Iida gave him a few small nods, indicating that they were at least paying attention to this portion of the explanation, but Uraraka and Mina responded differently. Both seemed agitated at the mention of that fight. The southern girl, in particular, seemed to get a thick layer of red all over her body as she avoided making eye contact with him, while Mina was staring directly at him, lost in a lilac swirl as she simply lost herself in her thoughts. He couldn't tell what had them riled up, so Izuku just carried on talking. Anyways, the source that activates my quirk can also be external rather than internal, meaning that my body doesn't potentially suffer any psychological or internal damage that I am completely unaware of. Instead, if I am able to deal a significant amount of damage to myself with something on the outsider like a knife or just sheer damage to my body, I am able to use my quirk. This is just a rough prototype that I was testing out, The spines on the sides stab my skin just enough to generate the energy needed to use my quirk without seriously damaging my body. At the minute, it's the safest thing to do. Izuku started to sketch the skeleton in front of him and consider how it might be modified. The metal covering had to scratch off even in its brief life, exposing the rustic glory of the twisting frame below it. Dried red patches scattered along the length of the appendage complemented the dull silver sheen lying across it. It paralleled, in a way, how Izuku's own life and outlook were developing. He had only recently discovered adrenaline, and it had drastically altered both his outlook and his future, making him feel more alive and independent than before, but it also bound him to a dangerous ideology that he knew was unhealthy for him. He could fight through the pain if it meant giving back to everyone in his life, to All Might for giving him his quirk, to his mother for supporting and helping him throughout his life, to his friends for being there and pushing him to rise above it all. And he could do all of that with his own power, with some that remained true to the value of All Might while still giving him a personal touch and patch of freedom. This power that lay dormant inside of him had heightened his desire for being a hero, his want and strife for becoming someone of such a high caliber that it only managed to push him past all of his quirk's drawbacks. But at the same time, it brought back all of those previous ideas about how it disqualified him from wearing the mantle of the symbol of peace. Izuku wasn't sure at this point if he was overreacting and worrying about nothing, or if this was a legitimate worry since his quirk was still developing and he couldn't tell how others would perceive it, but it was a worry that had imprisoned him in a vice-like grip of anxiety that he was unable to escape. Without a doubt, adrenaline was a double-edged sword. Are you sure that this is the safest option, Izuku? I mean, I don't want to be rude or anything, but looking at your arms I'm not so sure. The teenager recoiled in shock when she heard a gentle, sweet voice next to his ear and felt light breaths hitting the shell of his ear. It was then that she realized Toru had moved from her spot at the blackboard to listen to him mumble about his quirk. Simultaneously, her invisible hand was gently running down his arm, stroking over his bandages and the cuts caused by his quirk in a soothing way that made her feelings understandable to him. It didn't mean he wasn't anxious and ashamed to think he would be dating a girl of this caliber. At this stage, why yeah. I may have to use bandages a lot, but compared to what the fight against Todoroki did to me, this truly is the best option. Without thinking, his broken and scarred fingers reached the back of his skull, stretching and bending around the fractures and breaks left by the fight, as well as the stupid things he did when he was high on adrenaline. A heavy hand struck his shoulder and yanked him out of his head, interrupting his train of thought. Izuku raised his head slowly to look up at the impact site, but as soon as he saw Iida, his brow furrowed and his eyes dropped to the ground. Iida? Izuku, I think that you should reconsider using your quirk in this manner. Glancing questioningly ahead at his friend, he quickly discovered that the tall hero in training was the target of everyone else's stares in the room. What did you mean, man? He just explained that he can't really use it without risking himself. Kirishima, unable to understand why the teenager would want to prevent Izuku from using his quirk, started to lean against the desk in front of Izuku and shove his hands in his pockets. I only mean that he should try and maneuver around this aspect of his quirk and use it like he used to. You mean using it to the point where it broke his bones? You sure about that, Iida? That is not what I am insinuating, only that. Mina spoke next, presenting her own analysis of the matter and pointing out weaknesses in their speedster friend's perspective. Izuku was just thinking as she spoke. Why would Iida oppose this idea so strongly? He had witnessed his behavior with his quirk previously, so the subject of him injuring himself wasn't new to him. Perhaps the notion that extended exposure to agony would transform him? That the power it offered him would not make him want to better ensure his own safety? No, that wasn't the case. There was more to this than meets the eye. He looked down at his broken hands on the desk and rotated them so the palm faced him. He bit his lip and looked up at Uraraka, who was staring at him with equal confusion. Her anger and fury had faded and were replaced with total confusion. Izuku was staring at her when he started to consider what might have happened over the past few weeks that. He was aware. This is about your brother, isn't it? As soon as Izuku spoke, all conversations came to an end. All eyes turned to him, but the teenager was concentrating on Iida and his response alone. After a brief period of silence, he let out a deep breath and turned to face his friend, his eyes heavy with emotion. I saw Tensai's body, Izuku. It was broken and beat up, so bloody that it made me want to gag. That was my brother, that was the pro-hero Igenium right there, destroyed in a matter of seconds. To me, that is what you are proposing we let happen to you. That we stand by and let you destroy yourself for the sheer purpose of being a hero. Izuku subconsciously narrowed his eyes. Stand by? No, Iida. I just wanted to tell you why I need this device and anything like it in the future. Tomorrow. I'm meeting up with May again so that we can work on costume ideas to better get my quirk under control. If you want to talk to me about anything, do it, but you know that I can't just stop being a hero. It is that determination that scares me. My brother was the same way. He wanted to help everyone no matter the cost, be a great hero that made people smile no matter the cost, just like you. And after everything that has happened with this hero killer, I'm scared that one day I will be back in that hospital, looking at you in that hospital bed, all because of your own quirk. Izuku had seldom received this kind of attention and consolation, so at the moment he felt overpowered. That did not preclude him from making an argument, though. For his own sake, Iida was trying to get him to stop using this aspect of his quirk, the aspect about which he felt so conflicted. Yes, it was to prevent him and the others from witnessing Izuku get beaten and bruised, but that was part of their duty as heroes, to absorb the harm that others were unable to. The quirk inheritor shot back at Iida in a selfish act. Iida, thank you so much for your concern, but you have to understand that this is all I've ever wanted. As heroes, we have to be ready to put our lives on the line for other people, and even if I have to put myself at risk to even use my quirk, that is worth it if I'm able to save one person. My quirk, while not invincible, can help me bounce back from any damage I receive. I understand not to overuse it and rely too much on it, but it will help me. I am not trying to be insensitive here, Iida. I really am, and it's out of respect for you and your brother, but I am not Igenium. As Izuku said those final 3 words, the room appeared to momentarily freeze. It was necessary to say, even though it might have sounded harsh coming from someone like Izuku. After a brief moment of eye contact, Iida's eyes dropped. He then slung his bag over his shoulder and started to head for the door, but not before saying one thing. Neither am I, Izuku. Neither am I. As he was about to go, the teenager made an effort to get up and talk to Iida again rather than just letting him go and mope. But Toru stopped him with an unseen force, drawing him back with the same gentle, collected tone that she had used when speaking to him earlier. Even though it was a significant change from her flamboyant, extravagant personality, Izuku sensed that this was more genuine than that. The boy turned to face where she would be, and though he could not see her, he looked with regret and danger in his eyes. Let him go for now, Izu. He just needs this time to think. He'll be fine soon, but for now, just let him be. Izuku nodded and turned back to his seat, his head turned toward the wooden surface, too preoccupied with worry for his friend to notice that he had been given a new nickname. A few minutes of silence lingered in the room before a phone's loud beep announced its arrival to all. The source was Kirishima. He took out his phone and quickly browsed through it before biting his lip. Damn. Listen, I've gotta bolt it, but thanks for telling me, Izuku. It helped me understand a little bit more. I'll be ready the next time we fight, got it? The teenager nodded at his red-haired friend, grinning a little at the challenge and receiving a similar smile in return. As he picked up his bag and prepared to leave, Kirishima glanced back at the 4 of them before racing out of the room and down the corridor. Upon reflection, Izuku realized that they had been here for a while, and that most of the other people in the building had already left. A cough directly in front of him drew him back in after a while of distraction. So then, Izuku, the boy with green hair, looked up and could almost hear himself gulp at the intense glare he received in return, which seemed to burn the room down. There she stood, staring him down with a pout on her face and her arms crossed. Although she was attempting to appear more assertive, furious, and irritated at his words, all he had to do was watch the way her mouth and brow quirked as she attempted to maintain her composure. In all honesty, Izuku thought it was pretty adorable. Uraraka, I can't just give up because of what my quirk is. Yes, it is dangerous, and yes, I understand the risks that it entails, but I want to be a hero, and now I can be. I told you I was a late bloomer, so I haven't had the 10+ years all of you have had to train and get accustomed to it. No, I have to work harder to make sure that I don't lose control and end up hurting someone else with it, to make sure that whoever I save can be comfortable if I come to help them, work harder to make everyone proud. Looking back down at his desk, Izuku could hear Uraraka's mouth open in sigh. He didn't even look up from his desk, which held his bloody and battered hands, hidden from the world by bandages and curls of linen. He was too afraid of the situation's reality and of having his dream rejected again, as it had been so many times before. Despite his uncertainty about his purpose and whether he could become the symbol of peace in this state, he was certain that he would do everything in his power to realize his dream and stop others from squandering and shooting it down. He would live now for his own fantasy. He heard footsteps softly tapping on the wooden floor of the classroom until they came to a stop in front of his desk. He watched in satisfied, bewildered silence as the table bowed slightly under the unanticipated weight of Uraraka. He looked up at her, seeing in her face a softness that seemed reassuring and absent for a while. The girl calmly started to gently move her little hand in his direction, her hand being much smaller than his, until she closed her hand around his body. His bewilderment didn't stop her from continuing to run her fingers over the warm piece of linen. No, Deku. I can't promise that I know how you feel, and I can't say that I completely support this silly mindset of yours, but the way you smiled just now, when you talked about your dream, it made me realize that I can't say that I hate the idea or say that I should be angry at you for your decision because I cannot bring myself to be any of those things. She leaned forward, taking more of his hand in hers as she silently removed the bandages and let them fall to the desk with a gentle thump. Then, with reckless abandon, the southern girl pushed and pulled the cat-like pads on her fingers across his many scratches and scars. We care for you, Deku. You need to remember that. We care for you so much that when we saw you jump into action today, when we heard you scream and shout, our hearts began to beat like crazy, and we didn't know if you were really alright or not. I was so scared for you. Izuku froze, scarlet covering his entire body as she pulled herself closer and enveloped his top half in a tight hug, holding him closer to her chest. Please just be careful, okay? Sure. Izuku was moved to tears in the few seconds that she spent holding him because he could feel all of Uraraka's warmth and concern for him. It was unlike anything he had ever experienced, as he had never felt anyone other than his mother show him such concern and care. However, it went beyond that. It was that she could demonstrate this to him without having to say a word. In fact, she didn't even need to. No, Uraraka was able to convey this feeling to him without using words, and it was very meaningful to him. Alright lovebirds, let's get moving or Aizawa will chew us out for being here so long after school hours. Izuku and Uraraka shot away from one another, thick red blushes appearing on their faces as they turned to see Mina's sly smile, wide and adorning her pink face. Alongside her, Toru's colorful and multi-stickered bag swung around, displaying her impatient attitude as her clothes swayed and moved in spirals. With a sigh, Uraraka moved to get her own bag, and Izuku pushed himself away from his desk to grab his little yellow bag. With a final grin, the two faced their friends and exchanged the anticipated look. Well, oh yay. Do you mind if we walk with you guys? We sort of got ditched talking to you guys? With the same exuberant tone in her voice, Toru answered. Izuku hesitated at that. This happier, exaggerated personality just seemed a little off now that he'd seen that softer, calmer side of her. Since he didn't know the girl well enough to take that guess seriously, he decided to let her be for the moment even though it seemed more artificial and made up. Sorry about that. Don't worry muscles. Anyway, you owe us now so you basically have to let us walk with you. Izuku, sighing at Mina's interactions with the boy, stuck her tongue out at him. It didn't stop him from becoming a more intense shade of red, though. Did not assist when Uraraka intervened. Damn. She's really got us here, Izuku. Blackmail it is. See, can we just go please? Iida shook her head. His hands were coiled in on themselves, nails gripping and digging into his hardened skin as he paced and dashed around the room he was confined to, locked like a prison he joined of his own free will. It was a deep pounding that smashed and crashed against the walls of his mind, colliding against the fleshy walls with a fierce brutality that manifested throughout the rest of his body. If the boy could pinpoint the feeling and connect it to anything, he would compare it to chasing his quirk. A forceful stream of air would launch, rebounding off walls with a sudden burst of force and fury that tore and ripped at his head with precise and clean shots. With reckless authority and careless abandon, a rough pounding and dragging urge shattered and grated the floor of his mind, kicking and sprinting all over his vulnerable state. As Iida lay dying, bathing in pride, a startling burst of explosive heat shattered her and caused a cataclysmic retreat, with ambition and pride drying out and shriveling. Shame. Pride mixed with guilt. All of Iida's mental states, all of his emotions, and all of his actions could be linked to the all-consuming status of pride that ate away at his spirit, or the sickening companionship that guilt granted him, absorbing and indoctrinating the adolescent into a devoid cycle of shamed friendship. That was the essence of Iida's mentality. The Quirk's breathing, pulsating heart was still palpable to the trainee hero, rattling and flaring against the material of his clothes. The shallow palpitations and trembling sounded, to Iida's ears, like a wounded or dying animal. It was as though his quirk was suffocating his ambition, smothering him with guilt, and making him swallow his pride. Iida was the injured animal, a sick and deranged person whose body was disintegrating into a mess of metal and flesh and whose mind was eating itself. But still, he knew deep down that he wasn't entitled to feel this way, hurt and injured. Not with his siblings sitting directly behind him. Iida took a deep breath from the hospital window and forced it into his body, turning to face his older brother who was staring at him with closed eyes. The sight of Tensai lying here, surrounded by medical equipment and a heart monitor beeping softly, robbed him of the humanity he once held as a powerful and influential hero. In a world where the definition of human no longer meant what it once meant, it was no longer the straight line it once was. He was having the life and reason he built up for others snatched from him in a cruel instance of madness followed by machinery. Iida's sadness and tragedy overflowed his body, and his rage and anger bubbled over, sinking and melting into the puddle that was his emotional state. The boy felt his body quiver with terror and self-destruction, his eyes narrow and sharpen with desolation and retreat, and his teeth mash and grind together in rage and fear. Nevertheless, he was aware that he could not hold the schemes that bound Tensai responsible for this. In fact, some of the only things keeping him alive were the slithering snakes of science that bit and injected venom into his body. No. One man was to blame for his brother's agony, for his brother's forgiveness and suffering, and for his brother's incarceration. A man disguised as a hero but suffering from the unnatural oppression of a villain. Stain is the hero killer. Eventually, thoughts of vengeance and retaliation for his role model overwhelmed him, causing his brain to spark and shatter as he tried to reclaim the life that had been stolen from his brother. His hands gripped and dug into his shirt, his eyes shook and brimmed with tears. The only sounds that echoed and shook throughout the room were the steady pulsing of the heart monitor and a soft, quiet whimpering. "Big brother. Raise your head, Tenya." Iida's eyes flew open, the lids thrusting into the protrusion of his cranium. With caution, he looked up. Tensai Iida's beaten but smiling form stared back at him, masks and medicine repulsions hiding her face and body. His whole face appeared worn out, eroded, and cracked from wear and tear, and his eyes were lulled. Sweat and blood matted his hair, bringing impurities to his attention and creed. A plastic prison clamped down on his mouth, sucking and forcing air straight into his collapsing lungs. Foreign agents, who stabbed and tore into his flesh with reckless abandon and unrelenting force, restrained and controlled his body. His limbs. Iida was afraid to look down at his legs because he thought that focusing on the severe wounds from Tensai's apocalyptic encounter would completely break his spirit and condemn his soul to slavery. He was a total mess. A man who was a total mess. A disorganized hero. Iida forced a smile at his brother, shaking his head clear of those sneaky thoughts and breaking the branches of tears streaming down his cheeks. "Hello, brother. I am very glad you are well." Tensai let out an exasperated sigh, exhaustion and pain seeping into his every word. It hurt my body to watch Tensai behave and move. He took a deep breath and attempted to lean upward, pushing his pillows beneath his immobile form. He then slowly raised himself to meet his brother eye to eye, but he was only able to do so for a short while before he began to splutter into the insides of his mask, causing the plastic to become fogged with blood and spit. Iida's form caused panic, and the teenager rushed forward to assist his relative. "Tensai. I'm fine Tenya, sit back down." He pushed his body back against the steel railing, breathing in silence as the room sounded with the heart monitor's fast beat and pulsation. With a sigh, Tensai gave his younger brother a tense smile in return. "So then Tenya, how's school been going for you this week? We haven't had much time to talk lately." Iida put a hand to his chest and sighed, sucking in a breath he didn't know he'd let go. He rounded the edge of his brother's bed and took a seat on the wooden chair. "It is going very well, my brother. Everyone is just recovering from the sports festival and the class seems to be in correct form." "Ah well, that's very good. I've been catching up on a few of the fights after I woke up. You did really well, little brother, I'm proud of you." The corrupt pride that had been eating away at Iida vanished suddenly, to be replaced by a healthy pride. He nodded to his brother, a broad smile on his face. "Yay, brother. Thank you very much. It is a great honor to be complimented by a hero of your caliber, brother." "Hee well. Ex-hero now remember." Abruptly, a permafrost envelopes the space in a chill. Breathing became difficult due to the unexpected burst of memory that appeared as a terrible distortion and pushed its way down the throats of all the boys, Tenya more so than Tensai. Iida was stuck with that statement even after it had warmed up and the ice had thawed, allowing for comfortable conversation. "So, I'm not sure I've told you this yet, Tenya, but I met this really cool hero a couple of months ago, smart guy too. His quirk was super unique, something about gliding I believe. Anyway, I met him when we were on a jog and it was..." Iida nodded, gesturing that he was listening, but he was not. He had no feeling in his head. He was numb in his mind. His entire body felt numb. The words that had previously split open Tensai's maw simply deflected every word that was hurled at him. Ex-hero. Ex-hero. It simply continued to shoot like a rocket through his head and bounce. The great and powerful Ingenium, his brother, had vanished from the world. His empire of heroes would be passed down, his status as a remarkable and incredible hero would be recorded in the annals of history, and his title would be given up. Hearing him reiterate that he was paralyzed meant that it was a reality he had to come to terms with. Ingenium had passed away, furthermore, he was meant to be his heir. Iida was so shaken by that very fact that he nearly broke, shattering his broken pieces all over his brother's feet as a symbol of how completely and totally unsuccessful he would be as the next Ingenium. The amount of trust and longing being infused into his legacy unsettled him. Why was he being selected for success? His accomplishments were meager and his judgment was poor in comparison to the many others, such as Izuku, Uraraka, Bakugo, and Todoroki. Although he presented himself as smart and authoritarian, he was really just the shadow of his brother and everything he had become. Iida simply couldn't fathom the idea because it was so frustrating and crazy. And the entire reason his family was subjected to so much stress, criticism, and suffering was because of one insane and sick man. Blot. Iida's mind ignored all external reasoning, all calling, as he gritted his teeth and clenched his fist around his leg. Iida. He gave up all focus and current logic to allow the hero killer to dictate his reasoning and his attention. This insane psychopath put his brother in the hospital and made him question his status as a hero. This psychotic killer rampaged through Japan, terrorizing the defenseless and the deserving. This insane lunatic believes his ideology and reasoning will prevail over those of the heroes. Iida. Rivers and rivers of blood poured and dashed throughout Iida's entire head, cementing the heinous and horrific acts of a man whose loyalties lay in the tactics of war and death. This was the hero killer's bloodlust. Wherever and whenever he pleases, Stain commands and reaps death, punishing those who would stand up to defend this nation for what? Bravery. Why did Stain not care about what heroes did? How come his brother's actions stained him? Why won't his actions be significant to Stai? Iida. Iida's coiled fingers felt a cool, soothing force descend upon them, the warm, consoling presence of family seeping into his very being. Iida slowly turned his face towards his brothers, letting go of his anger and looking at Tensai with fear and humiliation in his eyes. His brother merely responded with a cool-headed smile. You haven't taken up the name, yet have you? Iida sighed. It was always difficult to decipher Tensai's thoughts. No, not yet, brother. Any particular reason why? He seemed to be asking a pointed question, but based on the way he spoke and the fleeting moments of calmness that laced his speech, it seemed as though he could already predict Iida's response, which was that his brother wouldn't be ready to assume the role just yet. Iida just sighed, hanging his head. I just do not know if I'm ready yet. I'm still in school and it's so soon after your attack that I just don't think it'd be appropriate at this time. And then there's also TH. He heard Tensai let out another rough sigh in the middle of his tirade. Then, as quickly as it had been used to soothe and relax Iida's agitated spirit, the same hand suddenly jolted up to gently pat his head. It's okay, little brother, you still have plenty of time to become Ingenium. Tensai gave his brother another warm, loving smile while ruffling his hair. This smile revealed Tensai's unadulterated love and passion for both his brother and his brother's future as a hero. He recognized the weight that heroic deeds carried, the cruel deeds and reclusives that the mind would wander to during times of suffering and when one was expected to be strong. At times, Tensai even entertained the theory that perhaps people forgot that heroes weren't just idols, advertisements, or public figures, but also that people were entitled to moments of weakness and conflict in addition to those they may defend. He was aware of that load. And he realized that Tenya would eventually face this. Thus, he had to cushion his fall, just a little bit. Withdrawing his hand from his brother's head, he resumed his speech. Living up to the name of a pre-established hero can be tough, let me tell you. It's an uphill battle that throws rock after rock after rock at you, never ceasing, not even when you reach the top. However, there is always an advantage to being a successor. You get the equipment and the tips and the tools from the predecessor to help you with the tough bits, yay. So, in time, when you're ready, I will teach you how to climb and give you the tools needed to become Ingenium, Tenya. I promise. The two were silent for a moment. Then, Tensai's words caused Iida to feel a great deal of relief and pride, and an emergent expression of amazement and delight filled his eyes. The roots and branches of the corrupted pride that had once grown upon his heart had been severed, ripped from their sockets, and allowed to burn. With this new revelation, he felt revitalized, empowered, and enlightened. The lights within his very soul were ignited. Iida shot his hands up to his face and started to command the air like a conductor, making gestures. Yes, brother. Thank you for your kind words and guidance. I will surely grow and become a far greater hero with your words and wisdom. Tensai groaned and laughed. Whatever you say, Tenya, just don't forget to follow your own words now and again. Plus, if you aren't going to become Ingenium anytime soon, maybe I can pick it back up. Ingenium. The wheelchair hero. Tensai struck a dynamic and fluid pose while moving, managing to get his brother to laugh a few times before a flurry of coughs and splutters shot up out of his mouth and all over his face mask. The heart monitor's harsh clicks and pings bounced around the room, following the tune of Tensai's suffering. Panic struck through Iida once more, but a swift movement of his brother's arm stopped him in his tracks. The smothering of Tensai's breath caused the moment to pause, and then there was the sound of cables shuffling and plastic creasing. Iida looked down at the floor, and his guilt started to seep in again. He had done nothing to stop his brother from suffering, and there was nothing he could have done. There was no brilliant scheme to undo the harm that had been done to him, no bold plan to take the perpetrator to task, nothing. Next, sin rushed into Iida's consciousness. Even though he was powerless to end Tensai's pain or ease his agony, he was still able to track down the person who had caused it. He could locate Stain on his own and eliminate him. The teen's body was covered in rage and retaliation, which used their tarnished claws to manipulate his fragile body and fractured psyche like a marionette. Iida turned to face Tensai and spoke again. I have to go now, brother. I have schoolwork I must complete for the due date. Tensai arched an eyebrow as his coughing fit finally came to an end. Well, okay then, little brother. Knowing you, the due date probably isn't for a few weeks, is it, Tenya? Yes. Yes, you're right. Iida squinted at his bewildered brother, flashing a broad smile that was evocative of Tensai's own. But do not worry, brother, I will sort it out in time. But to the man who smiled so broadly all the time, something was. The way his eyes were pulling against his skin, poking and dragging heavily along Iida's flesh in an uncontrollably feral way, and the way his teeth were grinding and mashing against each other in a way that seemed like a battle of cartilage, all about his brothers gave the impression that it had been warped, twisted, and conjoined to some sickening part of fate that twirled and morphed the happiness on his face to rage. There was a problem. Tensai simply didn't know what. The Uwa teen pushed himself off the chair and started gathering his belongings and getting himself together. Every now and then, Tensai would catch him when his facade crumbled, revealing an icy cold face of malice and agony that simultaneously froze and thawed everything it looked at, leaving everyone Iida saw behind in a blaze of searing cold. Unfortunately, his brother didn't realize the true extent of his collapsing emotions or the reason behind his intense reaction, which was to cocoon himself between a facade of ignorance. At last, Iida had put his blazer back on and gathered his bags before heading for the door. Iida quickly spun on his heel and forced another fake smile on Tensai. Goodbye, Tensai. I'll be back to see you soon. He was stopped as he attempted to open the door. You have that hero experience thing soon, right, Tenya? A hold off. A shuffle. I do, yes. Okay. Well, good luck on it and thanks for coming, lil brother. Just don't do anything stupid. Iida told him the first lie he had ever said, bending his neck to look back at his idol, his role model, and the person who had inspired him to become a strong and great hero throughout his entire life. I won't, Tensai. I hope you rest better tonight. Goodbye, brother. Goodbye, Tenya. Opening the door and charging out, Iida lost his balance as soon as he was out of sight. His gears and apparatus came to a grinding halt, supporting his broken body against the concrete walls of seclusion. His head was whirling and pounding even harder than it had in Tensai's chamber. It was brimming with ideas that reached beyond the surface of his skull and mediated a violent agreement of agony throughout his whole being. Many things grew and embedded their glossy roots and tainted branches into his veins and arteries in an attempt to drain his entire being of life and reason. Many things pulled his body around so that he was a puppet on the strings of his ideals. Many things swirled and swarmed his soft mind with poison and charms. Iida felt dirty in her own flesh, but he also felt freed. The same biology that had bound him now felt free and unbound. Iida felt a rush of action and adrenaline shoot through his body as he lifted a fist to meet his eye line. Whatever doubts or convictions he may have had, they were all destroyed by the divination and sheer force of his elevation. Iida's reward was tangible. It was set in stone, firmly affixed to the base of his bones, and blended into his blood for all time, giving his state a richness. Tenya Iida experienced complete and utter clarity in his thoughts. He was going to defeat the hero killer, exact revenge on him for his depraved and neurotic deeds, and then reclaim a portion of his own life. That is, Tensai's life. He designed this. Iida's mechanical body started to tremble and break, a haze of rage and retaliation oozing from it as he picked himself up off his supports, and the inner workings of her gadgetry started to spring back to life. Iida swore to demolish the hero killer's philosophy and eradicate Stain from society. However, the branches were now deeply ingrained, and his pride had once again turned corrupt, causing him to feel both victory and heartlessness in his veins. Iida's pride had poisoned her. Tensai sat in silence on the other side of the lonely cage. Something swarmed in the ex-hero's mind. His little brother, the only person he had ever wanted to look up to and emulate, was covered in rage and bloodlust. This was something he had seen before Iida left, something he had never wished to witness. Iida's face was twisted and bent into a snarl, his fists so tightly clenched they looked like snowfall on his knuckles, as tooth and tooth were pitted in a grotesque and deadly machination of injury. What worried Tensai the most, though, was the whirlwind that was building in his gaze. The whites of Iida's eyes became a whirlwind of hatred and animosity that grew and festered there, decaying and devouring them until all that was left was the husk of his younger brother's shining light, taken and stolen to make room for his rage. Beneath all that hate, there was empathy and sympathy. Which Tensai was most afraid of? It implied that Iida was fighting and rebelling for Tenei's stolen life rather than for his own destiny. Tensai felt a wave of cold terror sweep over him as he considers the ramifications of this revelation. He sighed shakily into the icy air, looking over to the window side. Be safe, Iida. Please be safe. Izuku was aware of Pain. Pain no longer served as the evil king or queen controlling the biology of his illness. It had neither a throne nor a crown to support it or to give him orders. Izuku had only had one for all for a few months, but he had already managed to free himself from the oppression of pain and break free from his confines by sheer willpower and agony. He had the scars, trophies, and mistakes from past attempts at escape and torture breaches to show his loyalty to the Empire, but now he had to carry those burdens beyond him. He was past suffering. The physical agony of breaking a bone or splintering skin, or the immense flow of blood or torn muscle, seemed insignificant to him now that he had experienced such intense pain and agony. In fact, it was now such a banal experience that Izuku was more alarmed than he had been before. In spite of this, the Quirk inheritor didn't enjoy being in pain. He didn't want to experience it firsthand or go all in. Izuku Midoriya compared the anatomy of pain to being thrown into cold water. It is simultaneously icy, freezing, burning, and suspenseful. The strain feels surprised and tense, but then suddenly feels relieved and begins to float on a bed of contentment. All for the greater good, and Izuku would take every blow on the head if it meant exchanging blows with pain and suffering to overcome additional limitations and become greater than he could ever be on his own. But the cruel thing about pain is that its branches don't just settle into one person. Rather, they have a tendency to steal victory from several hosts. And Izuku hated pain because of this fact. The wetness on his shirt and the wailing in the air brought Izuku back to reality as they burst out of his head. Izuku looked down at his chest and saw a mop of green hair that he knew so well thumping against his body repeatedly. With tearful eyes, Inko Midoriya gazed into her son's chest. Izuku IWASS so worried, I thought why you might have DD died. WAAH. It's okay mom, I'm fine see? Wah, my baby boy? He smiled slightly at his mother, who continued to cry and press her head against his chest. Izuku's eyes followed the roots that trailed over his scars and laceration, especially as they dropped and branched down his body, dripping and growing like leaves all over his pale flesh, crystalline roots and flowers springing up everywhere from the cracks and fissures in his skin. These were his rewards for allowing himself to feel pain. Izuku was constantly reminded of his own suffering by the indentations and curves on his hands, which served as a permanent reminder of all the harm he had done to himself, and the suffering that other people subsequently endured as a result of him. More precisely, to folks like this sobbing woman. Izuku encircled her with his arms, feeling a few tears well up in his eyes and fall to Inko's head. Why did his suffering have to interfere with other people's lives? Why did the things he did with his body and his goals harm the people who loved him? Why did his deep-seated selfishness, his unwavering desire to become a hero, his fulfilled love, and his desire to help others have to come back to bite a lot of people who are merely bystanders? Izuku sniffled, sighing, and inhaled deeply. Hey Mo. Izuku was about to speak when he felt a strong, stinging blow to his face. He backed away slightly, gasping with an open mouth and red cheeks. In front of him was Inko. A shaken and whimpering woman, her eyes full of a flood of embarrassment and shame, waterlogged freedom squeezing her eyes while a blazing fire of fury and maternal protection covered her entire being in the fires of motherhood. Drunk on her feelings and tears, she stammered and wavered as she spoke. "I'm so sorry, Izuku, but I had to watch you. I had to sit in our living room, in our house, watching you on our TTV as you beat yourself silly. I had to watch my son, my darling baby boy, break his body and beat himself up not only once, but twice. I had to watch you, Izuku, stand up and destroy your body twice. And what was it for, huh? Tell me, what was worth you breaking yourself, Izuku?" Leaning forward into the fading sunlight, Inko took hold of her son's face, which was a streaming, tearful mess. She started to thumb his cheeks, eyes, and any other skin she could find. She poured her whole being into those touches, all the tenderness and warmth she could manage to radiate from her being into those fleeting moments. "Please, Izuku. Tell me." The UA student genuinely struggled to come up with a response to that question. Why had he acted in that way? How could he muster such bravery and strength to not only make Todoroki embrace his hate and self-loathing in the manner that he did, but also to overcome his own hatred and excruciating dystopia in order to carry on fighting? What had given him the will and the fortitude to carry out his predetermined plans, which by all rights ought to have crashed and burned to ashes but, instead, had left him with fractured cartilage and an energized spirit? The power fueled by One for All would provide a simple solution to his dilemma. Having seen the eyes, he was resurrected to act more, to push himself beyond his previous limits, and to be plus ultra. Izuku was unable to dispute this fact, but it was more than that. Maybe he was driven by a desire for battle, maybe there was an underlying euphoria that activated his senses and made him lose himself in his quirk and the powers bestowed upon him by his forebears. Maybe it was a, in the moment, kind of experience where he briefly felt ethereal. Maybe every shot of pain felt like a bullet that brought understanding and enlightenment to his fragile soul. Maybe. His question had an even easier response. I think it may have just been pride, Mom." Izuku looked up through bloodshot eyes, seeing his mother's trembling form with her head cocked and her eyes narrowed. Pride? But you've never been a prideful person." I know, it was just that in that moment, surrounded by the crowds and all the heroes and all my classmates and after witnessing what Todoroki could actually do and how powerful he was, I guess I just needed to prove myself. He really is just so strong, and I knew how strong he would be if he used the full extent of his quirk. I suppose I just wasn't really prepared for how strong he could be. And if he was going to use the full power of his quirk, then I was going to use the full power of mine, even if that meant I have to hurt myself. Glancing down even farther, he saw a drop of liquid fall from his eyes and splash against the slick, meaty pavement of his terrified hands, serving as another reminder of the suffering and anguish he had caused himself, as well as the consequences. "I'm really sorry to make you or anyone else worry. I never ever want to do that, but if I'm going to be a great hero like All Might, then I need to always fight at full power and go above 100% effort, no matter what. I need to learn how my quirk works and control it, and that is going to take time and effort and maybe even blood and sweat and tears. But Mom, I need to do this. I just need to. I've been given this it's a blessing I even got this power so late that now I have to catch up to everyone else. I am going to make you and everyone else proud, I'll do it." There was a pause in conversation between the two. Then, with her son's head cradled in her arms, Inko's plump hands shot up to embrace him. She then shrank to the floor. She started to caress his wild curls, rubbing and scratching his scalp while tears fell and dampened his hair. "Oh Izuku, I'm already so proud of you. I just want you to be safe and happy, okay? I don't like seeing you get hurt, but I'll try and push through it. But I need you to promise me that you'll try your hardest to get stronger without resorting to hurting yourself all the time." The air was lit by a dry chuckle and a sniffle. "I promise, Mom. I promise I'll try my hardest." She put her son in a tight body lock and they both sobbed aloud. As they expressed their love and care for one another, a certain aura swept over them. The chains and restrictions of suffering and anguish that had been weighing the couple down for the previous few connections were suddenly broken into dust beneath the power of a mother's love. Izuku did, however, understand why this occurred. His suffering, his agony. That served as the impetus for this intervention. A cry for assistance and concern from the person he could think of as closest to him, because it was the scars that covered his body and his soul that caused Inko to endure this suffering. Izuku's hatred of pain stemmed from this. Izuku spoke up, taking his face out of the cleft of his mother's neck. "So, Mom?" Pushing her wet face away from her son, Inko looked away. Izuku. What is it? You are aware that in a few weeks I will be taking that hero experience course. Since I destroyed my previous costume, I thought perhaps you could assist me in designing a new one. A soft, breezy chuckle soared through the heavens. Of course, Izuku, however I don't know if you really need my advice anymore. Well, you did really well designing the last one. So I thought if we worked on it together then maybe we could come to a middle ground maybe. Yes, son, hee. Come inside now to avoid getting sick. Izuku detested pain for this reason, and he was determined to minimize the suffering he inflicted upon others. In one manner or another.